If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, for people who've had terrifying encounters with the unexplained, the unknown, and other scary phenomena in the boonies, outdoors, and elsewhere, what is your story? When I was a child, no older than 11, I had just made a new friend. I believe it might have been second grade. She invited me to sleep over at her house one night. She lived in a small, quiet town, about 20 minutes away from my home. Anyway, I slept over at her house, and I woke up from this weird dream about 3 a.m. The dream felt as if I were living someone else's life, and I remember when I woke up, I saw this little girl sitting at the end of the bed I was lying in, and she was crying. I sat up to comfort her and asked, "Are you okay?" But as I went to hug her, she disappeared. I think about this night almost every day, trying to think of a reasonable explanation for it, but it still stands to be one of my many unexplained experiences that sticks with me my whole life. So I used to live in the middle of nowhere, in a small town somewhere in Arizona. I have seen and heard all kinds of crazy stuff, from my brother telling stories to my mom being able to see and talk to ghosts like normal people. Also, I see and hear stuff as well. There are a few alien things we've all seen as well. So one cold, snowy morning, I went outside to check on our 6 chickens that my grandpa had. Mind you, we have coyotes around and one bobcat that lived in the huge boulders we had in the backyard. Anyway, I start walking down the hill, and I see specks of blood. I follow them to the chicken area my grandpa and I built, and I see that all 6 chickens had their heads cut or ripped off. Nothing else, and no blood anywhere but the few drops I saw in the snow. It looked like their heads went inside their bodies, which is how perfectly cut it was. Another story my brother told us was that he and his older friend went to this lady's house to do yard work and were sitting around waiting for her. Well, they see this guy across the street going down some stairs, which is odd because we don't have basements. So my brother goes and investigates and sees that the stairs go pretty far down, and he can barely see any light down there. The next day, he goes back and decides he's going to go down the stairs. As he's going down, he tells us there are metal doors, and it just keeps going down till he reaches the bottom. At the bottom of the creepy basement, he sees 2 guys chained up by their wrists and asking him for help. He freaks out and runs, and eventually he comes back home to tell my grandma and me about the whole thing. We tell him he should call the cops or something, and we eventually tell my mom, who surprisingly tells him to never go back because she's also been there when she was younger. The cops told her to leave and never come back. We all figured that maybe the cops in our town had something to do with this, and my brother never explored again or any further. So this story starts off when I was about 6 or 7 years old. A bit of backstory: when I was younger, every time I would get sick, I would experience Alice in Wonderland syndrome. And I would spend all day curled in a ball in my room crying because I couldn't make sense of my surroundings. Well, one of these times I'd come down with a stomach bug and start experiencing really intense visual distortions. My mother sat with me for a few hours, trying to calm me down, until I eventually fell asleep from pure exhaustion. After I fell asleep, I slipped into a very vivid lucid dream where my bedroom floor collapsed off into an endless void, and I ended up walking around on the sides of the walls. Very strange, I know. Well, this scared me to the core, and in my dream, I remember running into my parents' room to look for help, and when I walked in, the room was completely normal, like it was real life, except in the corner of the room next to my parents' bed, where there was a dark figure standing there watching over my parents sleeping. At this point, I started screaming and woke up. I actually stood there in my parents' room, but the figure was gone. My parents tried to calm me down and figure out what was wrong, but I was so distressed that I couldn't explain to them what I saw, and they ended up putting me back to bed and going back to normal after that. After a while, I just assumed I was sleepwalking and what I saw was just a dream, so I forgot about it and never brought it up with my mom. That was until a couple of years ago when the topic of Alice in Wonderland syndrome came up when I was speaking to my mom, and I started to remember that dream and brought it up to her, thinking it would just get a small laugh and nothing serious, but after I said it, my mom's face just dropped and a serious expression just washed over her. She then explained to me that when we moved into the house, she experienced some very paranormal things happening, so she called the local priest, who came down to try and cleanse the house. I don't really know about this stuff, so bear with me. Well, after being there a while, the priest let us know that the house was previously owned by devil worshippers who tried summoning spirits in my parents' bedrooms. Apparently, he could feel the presence of a dark spirit that was standing in the corner of my parents' bedroom, the same corner I saw the entity in my dream in. I still get goosebumps to this day thinking about that. I thought it was just a nightmare, but an actual priest described the exact thing I saw in the dream. It was very creepy, reminding me of Insidious films. Maybe I actually entered farther. At my age then, I can assure you that I was not using drugs. I have a very slightly open third eye, so this isn't a singular incident. I have encountered unexplained incidents all throughout my life. More when I was younger and less as an adult. Whether you believe in it or not is your deal. I am not forcing anyone to believe it. If you don't, I understand. That's okay. I am only sharing this because I want to. Not because I want to make people believe. It's just a personal experience. A little description of my room for context: it was pretty much rectangle shaped, and our house was made out of wood. It wasn't the biggest room. But it had space for my bed by the wall on the left, a little side table, and a desk on the opposite side of my bed. At the end of my bed was a cabinet. This happened when I was between 8 and 12 years old. Take note, I had not yet fallen asleep, so I was wide awake. They would always be by my left side, as the right side of the bed was against the wall. The buggers would laugh and talk as if doing it on purpose, so I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing this buzz of tiny voices. At first, I pretended I didn't hear it, but I always had a hard time falling asleep. I would also sleep facing the wall because, if not, it felt as if something was watching or standing beside me. Once, it got so unbearable that I got a bit pissed and faced the talking buzz with open eyes and said out loud, "Stop, leave me alone, and let me sleep. I have school tomorrow." I saw these mist-like little dwarves with beards and long pointed hats peeking at me. The tips of the hats were at the edge of the bed. They laughed and talked even more to annoy me. I turned on the radio to silence the buzz. From then on, I would always sleep with the radio on to muffle the little voices. The music would change, the channel would be different, or the volume would increase and decrease, and vice versa in the morning. For some reason, that room in particular was always extra cold. Any other place in the house would be warm. Even when I was 12, I would end up in my mom's room because I always felt uncomfortable in there. My mom said I even told her that I saw a black cat in my room when I was a little baby. How's that for sleeping? When I was a teenager and still living with my parents, I had a bedroom with huge windows that were directly across from my bed. One night I woke up out of a dead sleep and had this weird impulse to get up and look out the window. So I got up and started scanning the sky and noticed this red light, which I assumed to be a plane. It would blink every couple seconds, which is why I figured it was a plane light, except when it would blink and then come back on, it was in a totally different area than it was before. It would move in a totally impossible way for a plane. Then it got weirder. The next time it blinked and reappeared, it was now right at the tree line in my neighbor's yard, and then it blinked and was literally hovering about a foot off the ground in the middle of my street, which was in between our house and the neighbor's yard. It then blinked on and off and continued on down my street until it got to the end, where my street connected to a road with street lights. Once it got there, it just disappeared. The whole time I was trying to figure out what was causing the light, but it was just a literal red ball of light. I couldn't see any source or any type of craft. That was one of the weirdest things that I have ever experienced. So I've always been a believer in the paranormal. I've always found all of this very interesting, and at one point, I was very obsessed with it. And then I stopped for some reason. Since last year, I haven't been as engaged with this stuff as I used to. And during this period, some weird stuff happened. One day, I was lying on my bed, wide awake, and I felt like someone sat on the edge of my bed. I knew very well that my mind didn't make it up, so I jumped up to check, but nothing was there. And then, after a few weeks, this time too, awake, I turned to the other side of my bed, and I swear, I heard someone sigh loudly near my ears. This time, too, I was alone. After all this, I began waking up in the middle of the night without any reason. And at times, I would see scratches and bruises on my body the next morning. This happened this week too. I woke up with a large brown mark on my ribs last week. Does anyone else have any similar experience? Or any explanation as to what might be going on? I am sharing this with a family member who experienced it. Anyway, twice she has seen a very tall, human-shaped white figure on the edge of wooded areas along rural roads near our house. And once she saw it at the end of our house, and at that time she thinks she saw a hand or finger wrapped around one of our exterior walls. She estimates the height at about 7 feet, has no distinguishable features except for its humanoid shape, and is very white. Both times when she drove past the figure, her radio gave way to static. A friend of hers has also seen it, but he didn't share his story until she brought up hers. I suspect they aren't the only 2 people in our rural community who have seen it, but I haven't heard about any other sightings. She doesn't get a negative or frightening feeling from it. Any ideas about what it might be? So when I was about 7 years old, I was getting ready for school and going through my basic routine. The routine I had was to get up and dressed, go downstairs and make a cup of tea, make breakfast, and then when my older brother got downstairs, I'd say good morning to him. This morning was just like usual. It was a sunny day, and I was doing my routine, but it had been a bit slower than usual. I was making breakfast and had heard someone rushing down the stairs, and though my brother was coming down, I stopped making my breakfast and looked to the hallway door to say good morning, but upon looking, I didn't see my brother. Instead, I saw myself, the same age as I was. The other person stopped and stared at me without saying anything. The other me looked petrified. We stood there for a few seconds staring at each other, and then the other me ran into the bathroom, which was right next to the doorway. I hesitantly walked over to see that the bathroom door was shut. I opened it slowly and looked in, but they weren't in there. I looked behind the door, but there was no one there. I was so scared that I ran upstairs, bumped into my brother, and broke down in tears. No one believes that this happened. Has anyone gotten any answers? When I was 10 years old, we went to a traditional slave wedding ceremony. During that day, an old lady died in the village. Most people in the village didn't like her because she had done something strange some decades ago, dancing in the graveyard. I also knew this because she always tried to give me something to eat, for example, a chocolate bar, but my parents always rejected it. After the wedding, there was an after-party. I was kind of bored, so I decided to sneak out with my cousins and play something outside in the night, hide and seek. While we were playing, someone called us. When we turned in the direction where the call came, we nearly died from fear. It was that old lady who had died the same day. She stood there, just 1 to 2 meters away from us, and asked us if we wanted something sweet to eat. She also said, "Don't be afraid, I'm a kind Baba, grandmother." We rejected her offer and ran back to the house and told our parents. They didn't believe us and told us that we were in trouble for going outside without asking. For many years, I was really afraid to go outside during the night, and I can't explain how and why we saw a dead person that night. The following is my account of what occurred in the woods while hiking a couple days ago. After lots of frustrating research, I haven't come any closer to explaining my experience. Hopefully somebody who has had a similar experience or knows what they're talking about stumbles upon this. I figured someone on here may be able to help me out. On Tuesday afternoon, I decided to take advantage of the nice weather and go for a little hike or walk. I wanted to explore a nature preserve I had only previously explored briefly. This nature preserve happened to be nestled between a cemetery, a church or school, and a mental health hospital. After about 30 minutes of uneventful walking in the woods, I came across a slightly developed area. Tucked down a hill and in the middle of the forest, I was shocked to find a paved area and a couple isolated concrete walls. A feeling of adventure and discovery took over, and I instantly became excited to explore. When I stepped close to the paved area, things started to change. I started to feel a little uneasy, but I didn't pay much attention to it. When I made it to the paved area, I became confused. There was an empty metal chair sitting in the middle of the clearing on the concrete. Part of me was fascinated, as I thought this looked cool and creepy. I snapped a quick picture too to capture the moment. After staring for a minute, I decided to investigate the chair. However, I again got an uneasy feeling when I got closer to the chair. Due to this, I decided it would be best not to explore that area today. I slowly turned and began to walk off as I quietly said, "This place is creepier than I remembered." This is when my experience occurred. Almost like someone responding to me, I heard a loud and direct "Nobody likes it here." I quickly whipped around to scan for the person. Based on the voice, it would have been about a 5-8-year-old boy. However, when I turned around, there was nobody to be found. The likely explanation would have been some kid just playing in the woods. This doesn't add up, though. There was only one path in and out of the area, and I was standing on it. I also didn't see another person the whole time I was there. The absence of parents or any real route in or out suddenly hit me. My concern quickly changed to fear. I took a last look, only to see nothing, before I started sprinting up the path and out of the woods. I eventually caught my breath, but I still had no explanation. Even after I heard the voice, there was no movement that I would have expected to hear from a person. I've never had anything close to a paranormal encounter before and I've always been pretty skeptical. However, now I don't know what to think. I can't rationalize the voice or situation at all. Historical research hasn't given me any special leads. Please let me know if anyone else has had or heard of a similar experience. I may go back to explore with another person soon. Any information is greatly appreciated. When I was 9 years old, I slept in my living room. Well, there was a room adjacent to the one I slept in. It didn't have a door, just an entrance. Well, one night, at about 3 a.m., I felt like something was watching me. I looked over to that other room with that open entrance. There was a solid black being standing there, with glowing, fiery red eyes. It just watched me all night long. I went to sleep, and when I woke up, it was gone. Fast forward to the next night. At about 3 a.m., I felt like I was being stared at again, so I looked over to that entrance again. That being was there, watching me again. This happened each night for 3 months, so after that night, I always watched that door. It would never show up until 3 a.m. Eventually, I got the nerve up to debunk it. So one night, shortly before 3 a.m., I went in that room and looked for anything at all that would seem like red eyes or make a shadow that looked like a human. I saw no lights at all. Nothing in that room had a light or glare. There was nothing in there to cast a shadow. The room had no lights, and there was no TV to cause light or shadows. So, after I searched everything over and everything was good, I went out of the room to my bed to sleep. When it turned 3 a.m., I looked over to that entrance. That being was there, watching me. So I got up and got really close to it, and I told it to go away and not come back. I still see and feel that creature watching me from time to time, and my family has seen it as well. Same description. I've had many more encounters than this one. I have no pictures or anything of it at all. I have no idea what my eyes were actually resting on, but this story is 100% true. In the late 90s, my sisters and I used to walk along a stretch of the Katy Trail that ran through Columbia, Missouri. For those of you who have never heard of it, it used to be a 225-mile stretch of the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad line that runs largely through scenic woods and countryside and alongside the banks of the Missouri River. When the railroad ceased to operate, the tracks were pulled up, and the path was converted into a fitness trail. Here is a photo that illustrates what it looked like that afternoon. It was a beautiful, early fall afternoon, and one of my sisters and I had decided to go for a walk. It was late in the day or early evening, and we were looking forward to having the trail to ourselves since most people usually cleared out by that time. We thought that we'd have just enough time to walk the 2 miles to our usual stopping point, turn around, and get back to the car before it was full dark. The walk from Scott Boulevard to the Parquet Creek Bridge was lovely but uneventful. We started back, and at about the halfway mark, we started realizing that it was getting dark much faster than we had anticipated. We picked up the pace as much as possible without actually running and were laughing about the ensuing creepiness of the evening and the cloud of vampiric mosquitoes that followed in our wake. It was just to the point of dusk when visibility was not really an issue for about 200 meters, but any further and things became indistinct. We were on part of the trail that was slightly elevated from the surrounding area. Down the hill to the left was a large field, and on the right, a gentle slope down to a barbed wire fence with scraggly woods beyond. The ground down there was soft-looking dirt covered with freshly fallen leaves. We were just trucking along when suddenly movement in the woods startled us. I turned my head just in time to see something moving rapidly away from us, pretty much perpendicular to our current location, about 200 feet away. The first thing that caught my attention was the long, dark, flowing hair streaming out behind it as it moved away. The second thing was the pale lavender, 70s looking blouse with frilly wings that fluttered in the breeze as it ran. The third thing was the brown, indistinct, what can only be described as naked deer legs that it ran on. I say ran because it didn't bound like a deer would, and there was no white tail, and even though it seemed to run like a human fleeing for its life, it was moving very rapidly across a sea of dead leaves and yet made no sound at all. In less than 2 seconds, it was gone. I felt no fear at all, only startlement. We looked at each other and were both like, what the duck did we just see? She didn't appear to be overly frightened either, but it was still getting darker, and we still had a mile to go through the woods. We both smoked at the time, and at that point neither of us could run all the way back to the car, so there was nothing we could do except keep up our present pace and try not to freak ourselves out with conjecture. We got back to the parking lot without further incident, burned out of there, and went and told the rest of our family what we had seen. Seeing odd sights runs in the family, so no one was too freaked out, but we also could never come up with a good explanation for what we had seen. Later, I did an internet search for any murders or disappearances that happened in the area in the 60s or 70s but found nothing. This was back in the late 90s and early 00s. One of our things as a family was to drive around and spot deer. There was a dark, windy road that was perfect for it. Clark's Valley Road in Dauphin, Pennsylvania, for those who may be familiar with it. I was just driving along past the state game land fields before the woods got thick. All of a sudden, we see 3 bright white lights go from the sky into the field, off to our right-hand side. My dad slammed on the brakes, and we pulled into a dirt parking lot off to the other side to see if we could see anything. No smoke. No flames. Nothing. My dad called the police, and about 15 minutes later, the cavalry showed up. A few squad cars and a fire truck showed up. A little bit later, a few military trucks showed up. My dad tried to see what was going on, but they weren't really saying much. He told us to head back the way we came. I never heard anything about it after that. I'm not sure what it was, but it was freaky as hell for a 10-year-old. We still talk about it to this day. So this happened yesterday, and I am a bit mystified. So the two of us were descending downhill from an old fortress, and just as the sun came down behind the mountain, everything went completely and utterly silent. 1 minute, the birds were singing and chirping like crazy, and the next, there was silence. Like someone flipped a switch. You could only hear the wind rustling the dead and falling leaves. It took us a few moments to really notice the silence before it became really loud and noticeable. So we kind of looked at each other and stopped to listen for a bit, and after a while, something that sounded like a flute could be heard coming from further downhill. Every minute or so we'd hear it, 5 to 6 seconds intervals, nothing complex. It lasted maybe 10 minutes and then suddenly stopped. After a while, we could again hear birds, bugs, small animals, and even cars in the distance. But during those minutes, everything went deadly silent, and the nearest wolves, bears, etc. are nowhere near this area. And then there was the odd music in the silence. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this one. The Evil in the Woods is a true scary story about a young Native American boy who has a frightening encounter while driving home one night. It is a real incident that happened to a user named Navajoji when he was just a child. It was a cold December night, and I was just a kid. The stack of firewood was nearing the bottom, and my grandmother knew it wouldn't last until morning. She asked my uncle to fetch some more from the mountains. My uncle took me with him, and we drove off in his pickup truck. He chopped the wood, and I stacked it as fast as I could. By the time we finished, the sun was setting and the bed of the pickup truck was half full. On the way home, the sun disappeared from the sky, and it grew very dark. We were driving down a dirt road that led through the woods. I leaned my head against the window and watched the silhouettes of the trees race past as the stars twinkled above them. All of a sudden, I got the awful feeling that we were being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. My uncle had a strange look on his face, and he was staring directly ahead. Just then, I heard a tap 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 on the window behind me. I started to turn around, but my uncle suddenly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart started beating rapidly. My uncle put his foot down on the accelerator, and we began to speed up. It was the first time I had ever seen real fear on my uncle's face. I heard another tap 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 on the window beside me. "Look at me," my uncle shouted. "Don't turn around. Keep looking at me." I didn't know what was going on. My mind was racing. All of a sudden, I felt the truck dip as if something heavy had landed in the back. My uncle sped up even more and started praying loudly in our native language. I wanted to cry. I wanted it to stop. Once again, I heard a tap 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 on the window behind me. "Just keep looking at me and don't turn away," my uncle cried over and over. I could see he was on the verge of tears. He was driving faster and faster, pushing the engine to its limits. My heart was beating so rapidly, I thought it would leap out of my chest. It was getting harder for me to breathe. I shut my eyes as tight as I could and whispered a prayer. A minute or two passed, and then the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and let out a deep sigh of relief. He slowed down, and everything was quiet again. All I could hear was the drone of the truck's engine and the crunch of the gravel on the dirt road. My uncle looked at me and said, "We will have your father do a prayer in the morning so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the clock on the dashboard as I listened to my uncle sing an old prayer. By the time we got back to my grandmother's house, I was almost asleep. My uncle carried me inside and put me to bed. To this day, my uncle has never talked about what happened that night. A couple of times this year, I've seen a light in the woods behind my house. Not a torch. Much brighter. It changes location slightly, unless I'm just mistaken, but is always stationary and flashes between dim and bright every 3 to 4 seconds, with the bright period lasting longer, if that makes sense. Anyway, I went outside for a cigarette just now. I don't usually smoke there, but regardless, I felt a compulsion to go out the back. It was about 2 a.m., with drizzle and fog. I soon noticed the fog was being lit up above a part of the woods. That light again, the brightest I've seen it yet. I could see it between the trees, football-sized, and despite the flashing, the orb itself remained a consistent bright white. I'm not afraid of the dark or the woods, so I decided to once and for all determine its source. I went down the valley to the stream that separates my garden from the woods, crossed the bridge, and upon entering the woods, the light ceased immediately. Assuming maybe the valley had obscured my view, I ascended the other side, walking 50 to 100 feet up to where I had determined it was coming from. I shone my torch around, greeted with nothing but the dark woods. I turned off the torch to see if I could make out the light on the low cloud again. I then noticed a white shape perched on a stump about 6 feet away, exactly where this light had been. I turned on the torch to be greeted calmly by a small white owl, a barn owl, I think, regarding me. I said, "Hello there, what are you doing?" It stared a few seconds longer and then silently flew off into the darkness. The light may be from a house behind the woods, and the owl may be unrelated. That's the only logical explanation I have, at least. Or maybe the light is from some hidden wildlife camera? I've never seen an owl before, despite spending decades in these woods. Often after dark, I only heard them. Let alone so close and in such an odd circumstance. But my question is, to those more spiritually inclined, what do you think this could have been, or perhaps meant, if anything? I saw a mantis being when I was a kid. My sister and I were playing outside while our babysitter was doing the dishes after lunch. There was a cornfield near the babysitter's house, which neither my sister nor I had been to before, and I wanted to go into it for some reason. My sister, who was 8, refused because she was scared. I walked a little ways in and then cut over from one row to the next. I found myself no more than 3 away from what I perceived at the time as a giant grasshopper. It was mottled brown and a little taller than I was. It was looking directly at me and slowly pushing apart the stalks of corn with its hands. I ran out of the corn, terrified, and found my sister in tears, telling me she couldn't find me. We ran back to the babysitter, who tried to calm me down. All I kept saying was that it was looking right at me. I remembered it vividly and have talked about it often with friends and family, but I never came up with an explanation for it. It wasn't until 2020 that I learned about mantis beings, and when I searched it and saw a drawing, I realized it was what I had seen as a kid. 2020 was coincidentally the year that my spiritual awakening occurred, and things have been weird ever since. My boyfriend and I just got back from an absolutely stellar trip to the Phoenix area for the Innings Festival. For some background, it was his first time in Arizona. I've spent a decent amount of time in the Southwest, camping, hiking, horseback riding, etc., and I wanted to give him as much of the experience as I could while still doing the festival thing. Landing on Thursday mid-afternoon, we rented a car and went to the Grand Canyon for the sunset the first night. My absolute love for the place was reignited. My late-night curiosity got the better of me. I did a deep dive into local and native history, legends, and unexplained phenomena, knowing Phoenix was a hotspot for UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomenons to begin with. We ended up in the superstitions on our second day, not really doing any serious hiking. We weren't equipped for it nor did we have the time, but more to quench my curiosity. The area is absolutely fascinating, enchanting, and breathtaking, but also terrifying. That evening at the festival, after I had a few drinks in me, I began seeking out locals to ask them what they knew about Jacob Waltz's gold/death and the sup/cryptid/local legends/ghosts/monsters/aliens/ etc. Specifically, I wanted to find people who had their own strange experiences. They entertained me, but the moment I made mention of skinwalkers, the conversation fell silent. "We don't talk about that," was told to me by multiple locals in the most serious way. Which, of course, only made me want to know more. So, long story short, are there any locals with their own strange experiences that they'd like to share? Where can I learn more about stuff like this? I'm open to books and resources about Native American history and legends too, because I know that a lot has to do with this stuff, and I find it so fascinating. Finally, I'd like to finish this by making sure you guys know I come from a place of utmost respect and reverence for the land and its people. My grandparents owned a large farm in Virginia with a farmhouse that was built in the early 1800s. We spent a lot of time there as kids, and our mom used to tell us that she felt spirits in the house. Fast forward to 2003. I had just graduated from basic training with the U.S. Army, and my brothers and I decided to go spend some time at the farm. The farmhouse had been mostly empty for about 10 years since the death of my grandfather. We drove all day from Georgia and arrived at the farmhouse around 1 a.m. It was dark, and there was no electricity since the power had been turned off years before. We turned on our flashlights and headed upstairs to go to bed. While lying in bed, we heard very clear footsteps walking up the old wooden stairs, past our bedroom, and down the hall. They stopped, turned around, and walked back down the stairs. My first thought wasn't paranormal. I thought for sure there must be squatters living in the house. It had been empty for a long time. I had my gun with me, and I went through the entire house with a flashlight, clearing every room. I never found anyone. My brothers and I came back upstairs and went back to the bathroom. However, as soon as we laid down, the footsteps started again. This continued all night. Footsteps up the stairs, down the hall, turned around, and walked back down the stairs. It was as clear as day. These were footsteps. Not the creaking of an old house or any other logical explanation. We lay in bed awake, listening to it the entire night. Has anyone else had an experience like this? I was around 12 or 13 when this happened. At the time, no drugs were ever in my system. And we lived in the middle of nowhere. There were neighbors, the nearest one was about 1/3 of a mile away. But where the encounter took place, the nearest house was about a half mile away. Down a road, it dipped and went up. It was about 7 to 7:30 at night. And the light was starting to dwindle, but for some reason, I had this unexplainable feeling to go outside. I could say that I heard a voice in my head saying to come outside. However, that wouldn't really explain it. So, being the kid I was, I went outside my back porch, the front was fenced off, and started walking down my long driveway. As I was walking, I remember looking down the road, trying to find something. Although I didn't know what. As I got to the end of our driveway, I hit the gravel street road and stood underneath the only street lamp on the whole block. Looking down the long, dipped road, I could see a silhouette of someone walking. But I wasn't sure who it was. Then yet again, I felt, or heard a voice inside my head again, urging me to keep walking down the road. And since we lived there for a few years by this point, strange stuff was commonplace. So I just had to keep going. Even though I had no shoes on. I kept walking for a few minutes. I could see a figure, thinking again that it was probably a neighbor. But it was never fully concrete for a person. And since it was getting darker out, I didn't think anything of it. I was about half a football field away, or around that, from the figure I was staring at, in the middle of the dip at this point. Took off at me in a fast sprint. I took off the way I came, running as fast as I could. And at the time, I was pretty quick since I was a cross-country runner. Then, out of nowhere, I looked to my right and, swear to goodness, saw right beside me a pair of tall as me, padded like a mantis, legs. Sprinting fast beside me. And all I could think was to keep running. The legs stayed in my plain view for a good 20 to 30 seconds as I was running as fast as I could to the street lamp. What was weird, besides the legs, was that the closer we got to the lamp, it backed off. As I passed it for the last time, I looked back while running at full speed. And again, I could see a full silhouette. Tall, but nothing definitive. As I sped up my driveway, all I could hear was, "Thanks. That was fun." Or something similar. I ran inside. I told my mom what just happened. And we ended up taking the truck out with a floodlight to see if there was anyone or anything around. To this day, she still remembers the look on my face. I have something scary to tell you. In my old house, I have a spare room that my little sister used to sleep in. She recently moved to Alabama with her aunt and uncle. Anyway, the phenomenon went. My dad was at work, so I was helping him clean up her bedroom. I then saw the stereo that my dad had bought for her. It is relatively brand new, 1 to 2 years old, and hasn't been touched, dropped, or done anything to damage it. Anyways, I went to plug it in to listen to some music while I cleaned, but I forgot it was switched off. I ended up turning the thing on, then it turned itself off again. I thought it was a shorted wire, so I attempted to turn it on again, and it turned off again. I then decided to keep it plugged in, and somehow, it was connecting me to a spirit, paranormal world, or portal. Every time I said hello, the radio would turn on, say hello, and start playing music. When I said goodbye, the stereo said goodbye and shut itself off. I thought it was a glitch until I stopped the cleaning and went up to it. I said hello and goodbye multiple times. Every time I said hello, it would turn itself on, and when I said goodbye, it would turn itself off. One night, I was sleeping. I woke up to something banging. My young kitten named Ozzy knocked a candle holder over, and when I went to pick it up, I said, "Hello, Ozzy, are you okay?" And right as I said hello to my kitty, the radio turned on, with high volume, and yes, it was at 3 in the morning. I was so terrified. I decided to turn down the audio. I left the stereo plugged in. I then saw something out of the corner of my eye, so I quickly scurried to my room, hid, and locked my door. I then heard 3 knocks on my laundry doors. I quickly hid under my blankets, and then, right next to me, I heard my dad yell, "Charles. Where are you?" But my dad was at work. I thought to myself that I was probably hearing or seeing things, so I went to sleep under my blanket. I then woke up at 4:30 a.m. because I heard a banging at my door. I peeked outside to see who it was. No one was there. My dad worked overtime that night, so he had to go into work at 11 p.m. until 11 a.m. I thought I was just having a severe panic attack, but I rarely get those. Anyway, at 7 a.m., I went back to sleep. What I didn't know was that the radio kicked on again. I was sleeping, so when my dad came home at 11 a.m., he scolded me about why the radio was on. I explained everything to him, and he didn't believe me. The next thing I knew was that I had a huge, semi-deep scratch on my back. I told him that this happened late last night, and my dad was panicking. We decided to stay a few more weeks to see what was causing it. We had an EMF reader, and it was showing high amounts of EMF from the stereo. That morning, we opened the stereo and saw nothing wrong with the wires. The next night, my dad had to work, so I went to sleep. That night, I woke up to excruciating pain and a burning sensation, so I immediately went to my bathroom, and I saw more scratch marks. I then contacted my dad, saying that I was being attacked. My dad scurried home and saw more scratches on my back. We decided to toss the radio, and the next few nights, I woke up with even more scratches. My dad was off of work for vacation, so I quickly ran into his room, woke him up, and told him that I had more scratch marks on my back. This time, my back was so sore that I wanted to go to the hospital, which I did. The doctors gave me antibiotics and sent me home. With my back sore as heck, I've decided to sleep on my back. However, that was a horrible idea. A few days later, I developed a small gash in my chest. That's when I called my dad at work and said enough was enough. My dad still had his job. While he was working, I decided to stay up and watch good old Adult Swim on channel 64. I heard knocking in the kitchen. It turns out that my cat was rowdy and was being a butt, so I decided to shrug it off. I then heard someone say my name. I peeked around and saw a person who looked like Jin, and I blinked, and while I blinked, they disappeared. When my dad came in at 6 a.m., I was happy to see him. I told him everything that day, and we both agreed to move from our old house to our new house. To this day, I still have panic attacks about what I've gone through. This was some creepy stuff, and I was glad that I survived that. It turned out that the next night, our old house burned down. I guess me and my dad were lucky to escape before that happened. Thank God too, because I was all torn up. My husband and I were bored at home about 2 weeks ago. I mentioned let's do a walking trail to enjoy nature and each other's company since it was really nice and cold outside, our favorite season. He found a spot, and we drove there. The park is surrounded by modern neighborhoods, fancy homes, etc., so we figured there must be construction nearby since that's been happening around our surrounding areas. Anyway, we looked at the post about the trail distance options and decided to do the 25-minute walking trail because, of course, we forgot the days are shorter and nights are longer during the fall/winter season. We walked through a tunnel, think of the Brave One with Jodie Foster, and we were definitely on guard. The walking trail is surrounded by wooded areas. We passed a nice couple. After 10 to 15 minutes of walking, we suddenly didn't hear much of anything. The birds stopped talking. We passed a little bit more and noticed construction in place. After hours, no one was there. All of a sudden, everything went quiet. No birds, no other wildlife going through grass. We stopped then, out of nowhere, and a black shopping bag was in mid-air. Now there is no traffic, no wind, and nothing at all. If you were to drop a pen, you'd hear it. That's how quiet it became. We stopped and looked at this shopping bag. Now this bag was pretty far away from us. The black bag did not move until we did, or it was a coincidence. We thought, how on earth does this bag stay in the air for that long with no wind? The black bag started to fall, but it was very, very slow. Then we felt like someone or something was watching us in the woods. I'm not exaggerating, my husband said, duck this, we're leaving. As we walked in a fast-paced motion and looked back, the black bag was still in the air, only this time lower. We fast walked out of that park and hopped into the car. Luckily, since the sky is now dark. Again, not a windy day, no construction, no traffic, and no people. Only us. It was one of the most eerie encounters I had in my life. I had a few. This is the first time my husband experienced something like that, and jokingly, he always called me paranoid. Not sure what it was, but damn sure didn't stay long enough to find out. My partner and I have been living in a renovated duplex with multiple apartments in each half. The house is a heritage home that has most likely been around since either the 1900s or the 1940s. A few unexplainable occurrences have happened throughout our nearly 4 years of living here. For starters, once we were woken up to a glass being rolled or thrown off the bedside table. We woke up and heard it rolling away from the bedside table as if somebody had pushed it off, and it shortly rolled back towards the table as if the floor was slanted. This was between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m. We tried rolling the glass ourselves, but the floor was level, so it didn't roll the way it did that night. Second unexplainable occurrence, we once woke up to water pouring out of the pot light. No rain, no water damage from the unit above. The electrician came in and saw no issues. There's a connection to another story within the next few paragraphs that occurred at my partner's sister's house, which was confirmed to actually have some paranormal activity. Third unexplainable occurrence, the fan keeps turning on at maximum speed, could be attributed to an electrical short, although the electrician didn't confirm this was the case. The fan is located right below the pot lights, which water poured out of. In the same area, we have some memorabilia set atop a whiteboard. It keeps falling randomly, even when the fan isn't on. Could be attributed to improper placement. So all of these events could have had their own reasons for their cause. However, my partner's sister had paranormal activity throughout the course of a few months a few years ago. Their downstairs tenant in the basement reported a water leakage from a light. Their kitchen light pendants were once swinging wildly without any wind, and his sister couldn't sleep since she saw apparitions of a slender man-like character when she woke up in the night. They also invited a priest and a rabbi and performed a smudging ceremony. This is where it gets intense. The smudger had a metal pail with fire, and when they reached the upstairs closet, the fire got bigger, and they flung open the door and saw a backwards alphabet painted in an unknown red substance. Once the smudging ceremony was completed, the red writing disappeared, and now they have to place sage on the windowsills of the house. It turns out the house was built on an indigenous burial ground. They think this has something to do with the entity they felt. Now my question is, why are these odd events happening to us over 15 kilometers away? Are they connected? Any help would be appreciated. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I live in East Tennessee. Where I live isn't known for having mountain lions, which I know are known to make sounds that sound like a woman screaming. I live in a relatively small neighborhood that has a wooded area in the middle of it. This wooded area is small. You can see my neighbor's house through the trees in my backyard. This happened around a year and a half ago. I was outside at around 1 a.m. smoking, and I heard this scream coming from the woods. It was 3 short screams, with the third lasting longer than the rest. It sounded like it came from something of a decent size, sort of high-pitched, but it definitely couldn't have been a bird or a cat or something. I asked my friend, who knows about wildlife and stuff, but he had no explanation for what it could have been. Anyway, it was pretty freaky, and I still haven't been able to figure out what it was. I looked into coyote, bird, deer, cat, etc. sounds, but I couldn't find anything even similar to them. Does anyone know what this could have been? I feel like there's a rational explanation to this, but I just can't seem to find anything that I can believe. Any help would be appreciated. Thank you. Can anybody relate? I have experienced, in my opinion, a high number of paranormal or unexplained encounters. The first thing that comes to mind is sleeping in one of the oldest houses in a small Midwestern town. I, 13 at the time, fell asleep on the couch that night. I lived with my brother, 9, my sister, 15, and my mother. I rolled off the couch in the middle of the night and awoke when I hit the floor. When my eyes opened, there was a grown man standing over me with his hand out as if to offer to help me up. In my tired days, I accepted the helping hand without realizing I had never seen this man in my life. He gently laid me on the couch and disappeared down my hallway toward my mom's room. After checking the house that night and then asking everybody the next morning, it was confirmed that there were no guests in the house that night. Encounter 2, age 15 or 16. I was on house arrest at the time. No ankle bracelet, but ordered to stay home through court supervision. I had a friend over at night. We were in the backyard looking through the telescope between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. Suddenly, branches start violently snapping along the tree line on the rear side of our backyard as if something big is charging through it, destroying everything in its path. We look over and see what resembles a very muscular wolf running on its hind legs. It sprinted toward, jumped over, and snapped a chunk of wood off the top of a fence that stood about 6.5 feet. All on its hind legs. We both flipped after about 5 seconds of silence, doing the usual "did you just see that?" Months later, after telling my mom about this experience, she yelled for me to turn on a certain channel on the TV that was featuring a special documentary about the Beast of Bray Road. It turns out that the area we lived in at the time had been receiving reports of the same animal for decades. Encounter 3, age 17. While riding in the back seat of a friend's van, there were 4 people inside. We turn right at a busy intersection when an apparition appears as if it is walking on the crosswalk. It passed through the center of the vehicle, and every person in the car watched it pass between the passengers inside the vehicle as we drove through it. Encounter 4, age 17. Walking through a farmer's field with a buddy at night. The crop was just harvested, so you can see all the way across the field. Sharing a joint, we look over and see two people mirroring our body movements perfectly and in sync. We eventually turned toward them, and they turned toward us. We walked toward each other until we met at an isolated tree in the middle of the field. I'm willing to accept shadows as an explanation for this one. But we were about 200 feet apart when all of this started. It was around 2008 in northern Arizona on the Navajo reservation, just on the border of the Hopi reservation, which, oddly enough, is inside the Navajo reservation. I was working as an EMT for the tribe and had just gotten my medical license a few weeks ago, and it was one of my first shifts where I wasn't a third hand on the ambulance with two other EMTs. I was working a night shift on a spring night. It was a little chilly, but not cold enough to need a jacket. The moon wasn't really out, so it was another dark night on the res. We were stationed outside of the emergency department, working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. and responding to 911 calls. We got paged out for a man-down call to the Hopi village with no other information. We usually ask for assistance from PD in securing the scene just because that's standard protocol, and a lot of times, if it's a nighttime call, there's a possibility of domestic violence or rowdy people. But as there's very little police presence on the reservation, there were no police units available to respond to us. We were on our own. We responded to Code 2, lights but no sirens, and made our way to the village, which was only about 10 minutes away. We arrived on scene and immediately saw our patient lying on the ground in the dirt in front of a house. It actually turned out to be a distant relative of mine somehow. I had never met or known him, but I think he was my cousin's distant uncle. He was breathing, but drunk and unconscious, and looked as though someone had either kicked or stomped his chest. There is nothing requiring us to load and go, but we would be transporting him to the hospital to sober up and just to be safe. We checked his house, found some drunks, who might have been the people who assaulted him, and kicked them out. Now, it was a particularly dark night, and in Hopi village in that section, there were no street lights. The only lights we had were the big lights on the sides of our ambulance, which cast a big circle of light around the unit. There weren't any porch lights on either, so it was pretty dark aside from the ambulance area. What I first noticed was weird. Quite a few residents came out of their houses, mostly weird because it was about 2 a.m. but this is a small village, so I didn't think too much of it. It was pretty eerie, though, because they all stayed just on the outside of the line that the lights made. I could tell they were just neighbors, but they seemed reluctant to walk into the light. At first, when we arrived, there were lots of dogs parking and all the normal noises, birds, cars, bugs, etc. We were outside with the patient, just about to get him onto the stretcher, when everything changed. Out of nowhere, there was an incredibly loud howling that pretty much sounded like a werewolf from a movie. It lasted for a good 15 seconds, long enough to make us freeze and look at each other. It sounded almost exactly like a wolf, but it was odd because it sounded like a person doing a wolf call, but it was way too loud to be done by a person unless they were standing right next to us. You could actually almost feel it reverberate through your body. I had lived here for about a year at that point, so I wasn't super new, but knew enough to where I looked at my partner with "Is that normal?" look. Somehow, he knew what I was asking without verbalizing it and shrugged while looking around nervously. I looked back around, and all the people were gone in an instant. There was no one around whatsoever now. You wouldn't have known they were ever there. Even the people we kicked out of the house were nowhere to be seen. And all the normal noises were gone. All the dogs immediately stopped barking, which usually doesn't happen. If anything, the opposite usually happens. When there's a noise, dogs go crazy. We took the sign of everyone getting out of there as a cue to get out. My partner said, "Let's get the duck out of here," and we loaded the patient and were driving out of the village, probably the fastest I've ever seen a non-critical patient get transported. It wasn't until years later, after I moved away, that I saw the Navajo Cops episode of The Howler, but I found it pretty interesting considering the area in that episode was pretty far from where we were. Well, I had a mysterious, unexplained experience that I encountered. I think about this a lot, and I still can't figure out what it was. When I was about 17, I was around a friend's house. It was about midnight, and we went outside for a cigarette. While outside, we were hearing this strange noise coming from behind a row of bushes. We just passed it off as a rabbit, a fox, or something in the garden, as his house backed onto a field. I'm from the UK, so there aren't any other strange creatures lurking in the night here, just rodents or foxes, really. The noise got slightly louder, so we walked about 5 meters to our left and looked behind the hedge. About 10 meters or so in front of us, this is where we saw this small white creature or thing standing on 2 legs, it'd say about knee-height, motionless, looking right at us. As mentioned, it was pitch black at the time, so we only saw this white silhouette with dots for eyes. After about 30 seconds, this creature thing or whatever it was slowly, very slowly, like 10 seconds or so, turned around, then walked on two legs away from us back into the bushes. When inside the bushes, we heard what sounded like a dog growling, a deep growl. We got really freaked out and ran inside to lock the door. After telling the rest of our friends inside about it, they all thought it was a rabbit due to its color, height, and the fact that it was standing on two legs. As sometimes rabbits do when they are looking out for danger, but, as I said, this thing turned around and walked. If it were a rabbit, surely it would have seen us and instantly bolted back into the bushes. It still gives me chills to think about it, especially when I go around my friend's house where it happened. While out on a morning walk, I experienced something I can only describe as very unusual. As I was headed home, I heard a dog bark. I turned to see a man walking two golden retrievers. He was approximately 200 feet behind me and on the opposite side of the street. I walked 2 blocks, then made a left turn. As I turned the corner, I noticed, in a few seconds, almost 500 feet in front of me, the same man and his dogs. I was suddenly very curious, to say the least. I looked back the way that I had just come, and there was no one. As I turned back around, he was even further away. I started to chase after him but could not catch him. He crossed at the light and went into the adjacent neighborhood. By the time I crossed where he and the dogs were nowhere in sight. I put this out there as not being scary, just an unexplainable event. I wasn't hallucinating, I wasn't suffering from a psychotic incident, and it wasn't a bad reaction to something I ate the night before. Once again, a glitch in the matrix, perhaps, or a time slip? I'm certain he wasn't able to fly past me. It was just an odd experience. There are places in the PA wilds where few have ventured. Places that to this day sit empty except by all but the creatures that dwell within. One of those places is called Card Creek by those who know how to get there. It is named for a small creek several miles away and is the last sign you likely see before you get there. You can't really drive there anymore, you have to walk. In these ancient woods, there are stories of people dying. The most famous is an old oil drilling operation that was leveled in a single evening, leaving one man who returned from drinking later than all the others as the only survivor. When he arrived, the camp was completely laid to waste, and his co-workers were just gone. Other stories tell of people going out to party or camp and disappearing in the night without a trace. When I was younger, I went there with those who knew the tales and the way. Sure enough, there was an old camp with a couple of structures ripped to pieces, slowly being consumed by nature. The woods were old and dark, and that is when I noticed something I had never observed before living my whole life in the woods, the absolute silence. It was midday, and the forest was as silent as the grave. Not a bird or bug made a noise under the tall trees. The deeper into the woods you go, the darker it gets, large rocks and briars start to block the way. Eventually, you cannot pass without cutting your way through thorns. Sometimes there is a noise, it is nearby, but you can't pick the directions. Nothing moves, and you feel the eyes on you the whole time you trespass on this ancient land bathed in darkness and silence. Having been there myself, I have never found another place like it in the wild. First of all, let me just say that nothing over the top or scary has happened to me. These experiences are just noteworthy and strange. The first one happened when I was 15. My friend and I were hanging out in her living room, just talking about random things, when suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. I stopped in mid-sentence and looked directly at the movement. There were 2 humanoid silhouettes in the room with us. They were clear, see-through and no color, and when they moved, the air sort of rippled through them. At this point, I noticed my friend was completely still and silent, looking exactly where I was looking. One of the figures walked over and sat on the chair right across mine, while the other stood next to him or her. I whispered to my friend, very slowly and warily, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" And in the same manner, she said, "Uh-huh." Shortly after this, the figures just vanished. The whole encounter lasted about a minute or so. The second incident was when I was in my early 20s. My husband and I decided to take a walk around 4 a.m. It started raining, so we sat under an awning type thing in an empty parking lot, one of those things you park your car under. We were quietly talking when, out of nowhere, I heard a very distinct whistle coming from directly behind me. It definitely sounded like a human whistle. The kind of whistle you would blow when you wanted to get someone's attention. Startled, I immediately turned around. As soon as I did something, it brushed up against my hair and flew out in front of us. It was a pair of dragonfly wings. Not a dragonfly. Just the wings. I've seen thousands, maybe even millions, of dragonflies in my life, and this was no dragonfly. Or an insect at all, for that matter. We both froze, just looking at this thing hovering maybe 3 feet ahead of us. It was under the rain, and it didn't seem to be affected by it one bit. I kept searching for a body, but it had none. Imagine nothing but a pair of wings flying in front of you. I didn't know what to make of it. My husband eventually said, "What is that?" And I said I had no idea. But by the way, it kept hovering in front of us, suggesting that it was intently checking us out. Then it calmly flew away into the woods ahead. We've never seen anything like it since. I've always been a scientific, level-headed person who needs cold, hard evidence to believe anything. These personal experiences have made me realize that there are things out there that science can't, or doesn't, explain. If you have any theories on either one of my encounters, I'd love to hear them. So I can't sleep, and for whatever reason, I've decided to share this. I've tried to condense it, but it's still long, so have patience. I'm in the army, and I'm a firm believer in all things weird and unexplainable. I have many encounters under my belt. A few months back, we were out on maneuvers, just a big 16-day field event that no one wanted to do. More so than usual. It was cold and wet, and the food was trashier than we expected, no corned beef hash. We kept jumping to seas every few days, and it's a lot of work. We just jump locations and park the trucks. There's a big mud pit that used to be a clearing earlier in the day. The trucks started struggling, so for space and safety, they are on opposite sides of the pit from each other. Everyone bugs out and goes to bed. It's just me and the driver for the A500. He's looking at me in the dark like, shit, they left us, in the absence of leadership. So we head into the woods behind HQ 300 and start working on making a campsite. The driver leaves, and I'm working under a red lens to drop our gear. I'm alone, and the wind is shooting through the trees, making all sorts of weird crackling. Then I heard it. It's a subtle crackling that tries to imitate the noise of the forest. Super creepy. I'm low-key freaked out. It slowly becomes a pattern, like someone walking at uneven intervals through the trees. The noise is different, you can track its progress as it moves with or against the pattern of the wind. It's circling me slowly. I look around and don't see anything because the red lens doesn't travel very far, that's the whole point of using it. I flip my helmet over and spot a silver dollar with legs clinging surreptitiously to the inside. Duck it, I want to sleep in the truck. It takes a little convincing, but I talk the driver into setting up camp in the bed of the HQ 300, at least for the night. We tarp over the rails and start settling in. He goes to sleep almost immediately. I'm struggling with my socks and thermals. I heard it again. It's so close that I expect to see someone. Someone should definitely be visible in this range, even under a red lens. I even saw people earlier, and they were louder and easier to spot. Nothing. I slide under the tarp and go to sleep. Middle of the night. I'm awake, and I can hear it. Definitely not the wind. It's walking around HQ 300. Just steady footsteps, clumping quietly around the edge. It stops at the tailgate, where we have our heads. I tip my head back and am waiting to see hands, eyes, a face, anything come up over the edge of the gate. Nothing. I go back to sleep. The next day, we move our camp back up to our original place in the woods. I get to talk with the TC who slept in the cabin of our truck. I mention trouble sleeping, and he lights me up. He says he didn't sleep well and that in the middle of the night, something hit HQ 300 so hard that the whole truck rocked on its axles. It's a 22,000-pound LMTV. A light one or a casual bump wouldn't even be noticed. It would take a significant impact to shake it. He says that afterward he could hear the sound of footsteps walking around the truck and that they stopped at the passenger door to the cab. He had his feet primed for 15 to 20 minutes to donkey kick someone in the face if they tried to open the door. He's 6'2" and was scared shitless. It doesn't take long to find out that our tent and campsite are ducked as well. There's an uncomfortable aura that lingers. I have this intense and ominous feeling of being watched, like I am not welcome and maybe even in danger. It's so strong, I couldn't stay up there alone. There was a constant creeping chill, there was always someone or something behind me. My medic ends up approaching me and telling me out of the blue that there's something up there. He was looking for me when I was gone, and he suddenly realized he shouldn't be up there alone. He started walking away but said he kept turning around because he could hear someone or something following behind him, and it really freaked him out. Another guy confessed that he too refused to go up to our campsite because it felt really creepy, like Blair Witch or something, and another guy said there was definitely something up there and he didn't feel like he was alone. At all times of the day and night, you would feel it. Then I got a couple guys to come up there, and we laughed, joked, and shot the shit. The feeling got substantially tamer. Eventually, we jumped to seas again. Whatever it was, we had been living there before we arrived and had kindly stayed as we left. I have never been so happy to jump sites like that. I didn't have any trouble while I was out there. I grew up poor. We didn't have cable, Internet wasn't available, and we lived in a rural, isolated location with no other kids to go out and play with. As a teen, I would often spend my time hunting or riding my bike a few miles to the river to go fishing. I was the stereotypical country boy. I was and am completely comfortable and at home in the woods by myself, even at night. We had hounds, and I took them out alone that night to go hunt raccoons. I went to our hunting grounds and turned them loose, as I had done plenty of times before. I sat down and waited for them to open on a track. We didn't have the best dogs, they were young and not trained up well yet. If they couldn't find a raccoon track that would open for a rabbit, a deer, or something, after a few minutes, they hadn't opened, and that was very odd. I started to walk and call for them, but I wasn't getting any response. I kept walking and came out of some brush into the cow field so I could walk easier and go call for them into the next holler over. As I come out into the cow field, I notice the entire ride line, a couple 100 yards worth of ridge line, is glowing red. I first thought that the farmer was clearing brush and had a giant bonfire burning. I went to check it out and make sure it wasn't instead a forest fire starting. As I got closer to the top of the ridge, I noticed the glow was solid and not flickering like flames should. I noticed there was no smell of smoke. I noticed the sheer amount of light, and most of what I noticed was the color. It was a bright, vibrant red. The only way I can describe it is the way a stoplight on a dark street will cast a red glow on everything. That's the color that was reflecting back to me off all the trees, and in the air it was so much light. You know how a football stadium with the lights on can be seen even over a hill? I froze. This wasn't something natural. This was way off the beaten path, with no electricity. It would be possible for a lifted 4x4 truck or tractor to get there, but there is no way to make that much light without a lot of vehicles lined up with their brake lights on. I had a 20-gauge single-shot shotgun with me loaded with birdshot. I happened to have a few shells of buckshot and some slugs in my backpack. I quickly loaded a slug and held a few other shells in my hand for quicker follow-up shots. I prepared to defend my life. I was absolutely terrified and believed whatever was happening was a danger to me. I snuck home as quickly and quietly as possible without using my flashlight. I told my mom and stepdad what I had just seen, but they brushed it off, and I was scolded for leaving the dogs in the woods. I guess they thought I was just lazy and didn't want to go after them or something. They knew the way home and were waiting in their doghouse for breakfast the next morning. The next day, I went back and looked hard for any signs of what I might have seen. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, no burnt areas from a fire, no recent tire tracks leading to the area, nothing out of the ordinary, and I looked hard for something to explain what I had seen. A few days after that, I woke up and went into the living room. My stepdad was waiting for me. He jumped up and said he had also seen that light. He had been hunting in another location in the opposite direction of the house, but both were still within walking distance. He was waiting for the dogs to open with his light off when 3 bright flashes of red light lit everything around him. He said it was bright enough that he could have read a newspaper. We never had another encounter with the red light. I don't know what it was. I'm not saying aliens, possibly military, but I'm not ruling anything out, solely looking for others that might have had a similar experience. I used to not believe in ghosts or anything like that at all until I experienced it for myself. It's a long story, so I'll try to keep it brief. I became acquainted with a lady who was a Wicca or Wiccan, or whatever the duck it is, and she was really into witchcraft, tarot cards, and shit. I was using her house as a checkpoint to shower and do laundry, etc., before hitting the streets for days at a time. One night I was there and didn't have anywhere else to be, so I was going to crash there. She always told me her house was haunted, but I thought she was just cookie. She indicated her sister died there, and her son had also committed suicide in that house. My shit was in his room. We're, the lady and I, conversing at the dining room table, between 2 and 3 a.m., when I start hearing whispers coming from upstairs. No audible words, but rhythmic chatter. I'm ducking awestricken and asking myself out loud, what the duck? I'm not crazy, this SHT is for real. She's just laughing, saying, I told you. Before too long, I get what I describe as a harsh whisper directly in my right ear. It said, what? I popped up in terror and shouted, whoa. As all the hairs on my arms shot up and I could feel an instant chill on the back of my neck. The lady is cracking up and still telling me she told me so. At this point, I'm calling people to come pick me up because I obviously am not willing to sleep there after this. I get a ride, but my SHT is upstairs, where the whispers were originally coming from, and worse, in the room of the son who shot himself. The lady had mentioned prior that her only rule was no guns in her house, because of her son, and I had secretly kept a little derringer in my backpack. I muster up the courage to go upstairs and into the room. I say out loud, I mean, no disrespect, I'm getting my stuff and leaving. When I shut the door, every other door in the upstairs hall started shaking, all were closed, like someone had grabbed and jostled them, and I instantly walked down the stairs and got the duck out of there. I was shaken up and rocked to the core. My whole belief in life, death, ghosts, the afterlife, etc. had changed in the matter of less than an hour. It blew my ducking mind. I didn't see a ghost, but I sure duck heard them, and nothing like that has happened since. This was 12 or 13 years ago. This was probably the first time I had an encounter. It happened a few years ago, and we still don't know what it was. It all started in the summer when my brother moved out, and I was old enough to stay home alone. Now we live out in the country and are pretty secluded here. We only have like 5 neighbors, the 2 across the street, a nursery owner and his staff house, the cattle farmer, his ranch hand's house, and his mom, who lives in a small separate house next to us. The rest was nothing but deep woods. They're all nice people, and the old lady is kind of a second grandma to me, always breaking cookies for me, and we all got together for big barbecues and parties. The only thing I don't like about them is that both sides have family graveyards by their houses. The one across the street was in the front yard, and the one next door was in the backyard of the old lady house. It started Friday night at around midnight. All the animals, dogs, cows, horses, you name it, were going nuts. Even my dog, Phoebe, was running all around the house. I could hear our neighbor yelling, trying to calm the other animals down. Then, all of a sudden, it just stopped as if nothing had happened. The next day my dad had run to the store, and I was sitting in the living room watching TV with Phoebe. She hadn't left my side since last night. This wasn't out of the norm because she's a big cuddle monster, but today it was like she was guarding me from something. She seemed antsy, like she was ready to jump at anything moving. Then it happened, a loud scream from a woman came from outside. My first thought was that something had happened to the old lady, and I ran out to check on her Facebook right by my side, but she was focused on the woods growling. When I got outside, I saw her, the rancher, and 2 of his hands coming running towards me. They were asking me if I was okay. They had heard the scream too, and they thought it was me in trouble. I told them I was fine and how I thought it was the lady who screamed. My other neighbors had come over with some of their dogs, asking what was happening and what that scream was. My dad had just come home then, and seeing us all there, he was asking what was happening. Then another scream came ringing out, only this time I was a man. It was coming from the woods, then more screaming came out, the animals started to go crazy again, and Phoebe and the neighbor's dogs started growling and snarling at the woods. The rancher told one of his hands to go call the cops, then he, my dad, and the rest went to get their guns. My dad told me to go with the lady to her house, stay there till he came back, and to call mom. I did, and Phoebe came with me, but she never took her focus away from the woods. The cops came after a few hours, but no one could figure out what was happening. My mom came home soon after, and we all moved to the ranch house and stayed because it was further away from the woods. As my mom and the rancher's wife talked, the old lady kept looking out the window as the random screams continued. I was just trying to calm Phoebe down. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. All the animals calmed down, so the other ranch hands went to help search the woods for what had caused all that, but they never found anything. The cops left, telling us they'd patrol for a few days in case it happened again. We went home, but only to get some clothes for me and mom, because dad wanted us to stay at my grandparents' house for the next few days just in case. It never happened again, though, and to this day we still don't know what that all was. Up where I live in Cairns, there's a lot of local Aboriginal legends, and people take them pretty seriously. One of them is about a woman spirit who lures people into the dangerous currents at Devil's Pool, where 20 people have drowned since the 1960s. My good friend claims she can sense spirits, and whether or not you believe in it, she is fully convinced and just knows that she does not like having this ability. Anyway, she had a bad experience at this particular spot. Her boyfriend, and my ex-boyfriend went swimming there, stupidly. They all got weird vibes and realized it was way deeper, and the current was quite stronger than it looked. So they left quickly, around sunset. My friend says that she and her boyfriend were followed home by the spirit, and it messed around with them that night, moving stuff and making noise, until they both fled their house screaming. Like, 2 people have drowned there in the last year alone. Another nearby spot is the Goldsboro Valley Campgrounds, which I know a few locals avoid for bad vibes. It used to be a major meeting spot for the Aboriginal tribes, but once gold was discovered in the valley, the newly arrived men mistreated the Aboriginals. I camped there years ago and had a distressing incident in the toilets where I heard loud, strange noises and shuffling, but there was no person or animal around. It gave me the heebie-jeebies, and a few days later I told my coworker. She is First Nations and was like, "Oh girl, don't camp there again." A few years later, different co-workers camped there and saw strange lights in the trees and heard yelling all around them one night. They left first thing in the morning. 5 years ago my daughter, who was 7 at the time, was staying over at my mom's house for the night. The next morning, when I picked her up, she told me about the movie they watched and the games they played, typical stuff. But he said to me, "Daddy, I thought you died before you were born." Last night before bed, he told me that he was here to look after me, he even knew my name. "Oh, and Daddy, he said he loves you and he's proud of you." I told her that I'm sure he is looking after you, but it was probably a dream. Even still, she was adamant that she had met him. "No Daddy. He came to say goodnight after Grandma tucked me in, I promise. He had glasses, a leather coat, and a shirt with red squares on it." ISHT a brick. I've only ever seen one picture of my father. I understand that's a bit strange. My mom kept it in her safe along with some personal sentimental items, important PW, and such. It was never on display, so the fact that my daughter described exactly what he was wearing may have been a bit odd, but I just figured my mom showed her the picture. I called my mom when I got home and asked. She said she couldn't have because the picture was given to my half-sister Kate along with some of his belongings about 5 years ago when they contacted her on internet, which is true, I just didn't remember at the time. There's no way my daughter could have seen that picture. I've never spoken to my half-sister, and she lives in California. There is no explanation whatsoever. Last night, my girlfriend, sister, and I went down to the river beach near my college. My girlfriend and I do this frequently, and yesterday my younger sister came up to visit for the night, so we decided to take her down to the little beach on the side of the river that runs through campus to have a fire and hang out. When walking out to the beach, there's about a 10 to 15 minute walk through the woods. When walking down to the beach, we stayed on the trail and had no issues at all. We hung out on the beach for about an hour and a half before we decided we wanted to head back and watch a movie in my and my girlfriend's dorm. When walking back, we happened to lose the trail as everything was covered in leaves. An important aspect of this story is that there is a clearing where power lines run almost halfway between the beach and the street at the beginning of the trail. This clearing consists of tall grass and pricker bushes that make it difficult to cross if not on the one trail through it. A little while before this clearing, we lost the trail. We had the idea to walk straight in the direction of the clearing, and once we found it, we would walk alongside it until we found the cut-through trail. Now it was dark, so we all had our phone flashlights on, and my little sister was even playing music on her phone. We found the clearing and started walking along the side of it, trying to find the trail. My girlfriend was a few feet behind my sister, and when I heard the music my sister was playing, I heard a branch snap coming from deeper in the woods. I told my sister to turn off her music and began scanning the area I thought I heard the noise come from with my light. At first, I didn't see anything, and when my girlfriend asked me what it was, I said nothing and continued trying to find the trail. I was still slightly uneasy, so I continued scanning the direction I heard the noise come from with my light. I noticed something white with what appeared to be ears standing very still in the direction I heard the noise come from. I couldn't tell if it was some type of animal or just something that looked like an animal. I didn't say anything for a second because I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me, as I couldn't see any eyes reflecting my light. This thing was about 15 to 20 feet away, so I assumed if it was an animal, I would see its eyes reflecting my light. It was also standing very still, so I believed my eyes were playing tricks on me. I moved my light for a second to continue looking for the trail, and when I shined it back in the direction of that thing, I saw it violently swaying back and forth. I said, "What is that?" and turned around when my sister looked and screamed, "Why is it moving like that?" I have never heard my sister sound so scared, so I yelled to my girlfriend and sister to run. We ran straight through the tall grass and pricker bushes until we came out the other side. My sister fell and lost both of her shoes. I helped her up and told her to forget the shoes, and we all continued running in the direction we believed the trail to be. Thankfully, we eventually found the trail again, and we didn't stop running until we got out of the woods. When we got back on the street, we all calmed down and began talking about what we saw. I saw it first and knew something was off when I saw it swaying back and forth. It was very unnatural, and I can only describe it as looking limp, sort of like a slinky. It didn't look like something a human could do. My girlfriend and sister saw it after I turned to look for the way out. They both said it began charging at us, and it was still swaying like that while coming at us. This was unbeknownst to me at the time. I never saw it charge at us, so learning this information made it even scarier. Even weirder, we all never saw its face and couldn't fully make out its shape. My girlfriend and sister did both say it was running on 2 legs and was upright like a person, but it was moving in a way that didn't seem possible for someone to move. The whole thing doesn't make any sense, and we've been trying to explain it ever since it happened, but no scenario we can think of makes any sense. To make it even scarier, my girlfriend mentioned that when we first got to the beach, she heard someone walking in the woods behind her as my sister and I were busy getting the fire started. This could be totally unrelated, but the thought of this person or thing watching us the whole time we were there really freaked us out. If anyone has any idea what this might have been, please feel free to share your insight, as we are all completely stumped. It was around October or November 1997, and my family had a very close encounter with a UFO. Long story short, we were all in the house, doing our own thing. It was around 8 p.m. because I remember my sister and I used to watch Tim Allen's home improvement show all the time. We were just hanging out in the house. My father was in the garage downstairs, my mother was in her room, and I was on the computer in my room playing games out of nowhere. We heard this massive ear-shattering humming sound. Like the loudest sound you could think of. Ear-splitting sound that shook the whole house. We thought that my father was doing something crazy in the garage, as he had a lot of tools and a whole workshop downstairs, but this felt bigger than anything he could do in his garage. He ran upstairs, looking really scared. The sound was so loud that we had to scream at the top of our lungs just to try and hear one another in the same room. Suddenly, a green light hits our house, but this light did not just come through the windows, it also came through the walls. Everything was green in the house. I remember looking down at my hands, and they were this pale green color. The walls were green, and everything seemed to slow down. I ran and looked out my mother's window and looked outside. Everything was bathed in this green light. I remember that I could clearly see the individual trees in the woods outside the window. It was 8 p.m. at night in the fall, and it went from pitch black outside to bright, like a green sun was shining right over the house. I never knew my father even had a gun in the house. Suddenly, I see my father pull out a rifle out of nowhere and start loading it on the bed. My mother is screaming, and my father goes into military mode and starts screaming at the top of his lungs at my mother to get everyone's IDs, wallet and some cash and that we were leaving. My sister and I started to freak out, and suddenly, just as soon as it started, the humming sound and the green light just stopped. The whole thing lasted maybe 40 to 60 seconds, but it felt like it lasted forever. Everything was super silent after that, and my father went out to check on the neighbors with his gun in hand and see if they were all okay. The neighbor next door was from a Spanish family, and the husband was an NYPD cop. He met my father at his front door with his gun drawn, and my father said the whole family was huddled in the living room, looking really, really scared. The whole family said to my father that they saw this triangle-shaped thing beaming green light down on the entire area before just shooting off into the sky. My father returned and told us that the neighbors saw something in the sky. Maybe 10 to 20 minutes later, everyone in our rural area lost power for the entire night. My family was so scared that we all slept in the same bedroom that night for the first time ever. My mother said she would have weird dreams after, and she felt really scared driving home alone at night for weeks, like she was being watched. My father called the power and electric companies the next day, and they reported no power outages or any strange activity in our area. I lived in the Hudson Valley, New York, and found out when I was much older that our area was a hotbed of UFO activity in the 80s and early 90s. This was also around the time of the Hale-Bopp comet, which was also followed by a large amount of UFO activity. My family still talks about that night to this day, and no one in my family has any misunderstanding or fuzzy memory about exactly what we experienced that night. So, when I was around 12 years old or so, my best friend and I at the time were super into all things paranormal. We would purposely seek out situations that would expose us to ghosts, entities, etc., and I firmly believe if you go looking hard enough, you begin to open the door to these occurrences. We often had her parents take us to Savannah, Georgia, known for being a particularly haunted city due to its history, to stay in the same hotel room a woman killed herself in hopes of seeing her, ghost tours, you name it. Unfortunately for us, most of the time we never experienced anything. However, the scariest experience I had with her has always come back to mind over the years. I always try to rationalize it, but to this day, I haven't been able to come up with a good explanation. I'm wondering if you all can help. We are from a small town in Georgia, Milledgeville, notorious for its old, now mostly abandoned insane asylum, Central State Hospital. It has a cemetery with many paranormal sightings and an extensive history. It's called Memory Hill. It was the night before Halloween, and we decided to be reckless and go to the cemetery and do all the things you are not supposed to do. There's a wrought iron fence surrounding a plot of graves there, and the fence looks like it has little devilish faces in it, believed to have been placed to ward off evil spirits. On All Hallows Eve, it is said you can hear wailing and screeching coming from this area of the cemetery. The tale goes that you are not to touch the fence on All Hallows Eve so as to not release the evil. So, of course, we decided to touch it. There's a witch's grave there from a woman named Dixie Haygood, who lived 1861 to 1915. Legend goes, you are not to cast a shadow on her grave, or you will bear the full weight of the curse she was believed to have cast before she died. So naturally, we did just that. There's a mausoleum there from William Fish, who had his wife and daughter taken by the typhoid epidemic in 1872. After he constructed the mausoleum, he himself entered inside, closed the door, and shot himself to be with them. Legend has it that if you knock on the door, you may hear a knock in reply. We knocked. No reply. When we were leaving, we noticed a friendly black cat in the cemetery. She was very sweet. She came up to us, purring and rubbing our legs, and followed us for a while. Her mom, our ride, is an avid animal lover, and we all agreed to take her in and bring her to the local no-kill shelter the next day, as she really seemed like someone's house cat. We had never seen her there before and went fairly frequently. In hindsight, this was not a good idea, as this cat has likely always lived there and was perfectly happy. But we took the black cat with us from the cemetery that day. We named her Siren. Now, fast forward to nighttime. My friend had a clubhouse located fairly far in her backyard, out next to the woods. She has a fenced-in backyard with a pool, and you have to exit the fence to walk out to the clubhouse. We decided to sleep there to add to the scary vibes. We decided to keep Siren in the clubhouse that night with us. At the time, the door on the clubhouse was broken and wouldn't close all the way or lock. We stay up for a while talking, maybe until 1 to 2 a.m., but I have no idea since we didn't have cell phones at the time. Siren begins going absolutely bonkers. Hissing and growling constantly, she wouldn't let you near her. Now, I'm sure it's because we uprooted this poor thing and put her in a small, unfamiliar room with unfamiliar people. My friend and I are chatting, and I hear a loud knock on the floor from underneath the clubhouse. The clubhouse is lifted on a few cement blocks, so there is definitely room for someone to crawl under. I ignored it, thinking it could be anything. Then I hear it maybe 1 to 2 more times, also ignoring it. Then, there's a loud knock that comes from directly underneath where my friend is sitting on the floor. She jumps, and I tell her I've heard a few knocks before but didn't want to say anything. She said she had heard them too, and she was also trying to pretend she hadn't. But this one you couldn't ignore. The knocking starts happening more frequently, seemingly from multiple locations underneath us at the same time. Then, we hear a knock on one wall of the clubhouse as well. The knocking picks up and is very loud, eventually spreading to all 4 walls of the clubhouse and underneath us, surrounding us. All at the same time. I'm in tears at this point because I'm so scared and want to run out and make a break for it to her house. My friend adamantly did not want to do that because she was afraid to leave. The knocking and banging continues for quite some time, on all 4 walls and underneath us simultaneously. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just her dad playing a trick on us, but we couldn't explain how it would be coming from all sides and below the clubhouse at once. She eventually convinces me it was probably her cat, so I am eventually able to fall asleep. The knocking continued the entire time. The next morning, the knocking had stopped. My friend later tells me she didn't think it could be her cats but was trying to calm me down at the time. To this day, we have no idea what could have caused the knocking. It was very loud and intense at times, shaking the clubhouse. I am hoping someone may have a logical explanation. Or was this truly some demonic or unfriendly entity warning us not to be dumb kids on All Hallows Eve? As for Siren, we took her back to the cemetery the next day and released the poor thing back to her home. Back in 2009, my dad, who was ill, stayed at my older brother's house so he could be taken care of. My dad stayed in a downstairs room, and I would visit him often, but mostly during the day. One time, for whatever reason, I decided to stay the night. It was about 2 to 3 a.m., and I was watching something on my laptop with headphones in, but I heard fast footsteps, like if someone was running back and forth, coming from the upstairs hallway area. My nieces, who were teenagers at the time, would stay up late until the early hours of the morning, so I figured they were playing around or something, and I went back to watching my show. The episode I was watching ended, and before the next episode started, there was a brief silence, and I heard footsteps again. I texted both my nieces, saying something like, "Why are y'all still awake and running around?" But I got no response. I was going to go upstairs to see what they were doing, but I was too lazy, so instead I put on some music and fell asleep. The next day, one of my nieces texts me back and says, "Why did you ask that? We were asleep, no one was awake upstairs." I told her I heard someone running around upstairs. That's when she told me there is a mischievous little boy ghost at their house that likes to hang out in the hallway and stairs. When I was young, I was a very awkward kid. I had a lot of difficulty making and keeping friends. I spent most of my time hiking outside of my hometown in the Angeles National Forest. I lived with my grandmother in the town of Wrightwood. I would spend most of my nights out camping, claiming to be going on small trips with my Boy Scout troop, when in reality I would just take my backpacking tent and find a nice, secluded canyon to sleep in. Whenever I would sleep in the canyon, I would have strange but comforting dreams where my childhood dog, Shelby Lynn, would come find me in the woods, huddle up in my sleeping bag to stay warm, and I would talk to her throughout the night about my woes and my accomplishments. It always felt surreal when I woke up and she wasn't there, so I tried to go back as often as possible just so I could see her again. All the way up until I turned 16. I stopped coming to the mountains as often because I was spending a lot of time with my girlfriend down in the high desert. One day, about a year into our relationship, I decided to take her hiking up one of my favorite canyons. About halfway up the canyon, she slipped and badly twisted her ankle. It was swollen to the size of a grapefruit. I asked her to let me carry her back down or to let me tear a piece off my shirt to use as a sling, but she refused, so we continued down. About 10 minutes into our hike down, she said she saw something. I asked her what it was, and she said she didn't know, just movement in her peripherals. Then, about 5 seconds later, something scared her so badly that she almost fell again. I took her back home, and we treated her ankle with a sling and a compression wrap. To this day, she still refuses to acknowledge what happened, and I think perhaps that's for the best. When I was 17, we eventually broke up. Her mother had gotten into an accident while drinking and driving, and she was forced to move in with her grandparents. We couldn't keep up the long-distance relationship. I continued going to the mountains for 2 more relationships and 2 more years, but I never brought anybody to the mountains with me during that time. I simply spent half my free time with my boyfriend or girlfriend and the other half in the mountains, dreaming of my childhood dog in bliss. When I was 19, I met a girl who really understood me as a person. Foolishly, I thought that meant she might understand what was happening to me in those mountains. I told her all about my dreams and all about what happened to my first ex. She wanted to try to see for herself. We left at about 8 p.m. and arrived at the base of my favorite canyon at about 9 p.m. Me and my then girlfriend went hiking up with flashlights and some camping gear, hoping to spend the night. We spent a good 20 minutes setting up a site where I cleared all the flammables in a 5-foot radius and started cooking in my jet boiler. We had some dinner, and although I can't remember what we ate, I think it was just Uncle Ben's rice and some bread. Then we decided to walk around some more. About 20 minutes into this hike, she stopped dead in her tracks. She had seen something moving, just like my first ex. She looked at me and asked me if I saw it too. I hadn't. Then she took another look and let out a small whisper of a scream. She grabbed me and asked me to take her back to our camp so we could leave. Later, she described to me a scraggly, dark, long-haired dog that looked to be about as tall as her, 5'3", and covered in mange and forest debris. She told me it grinned at her and that its mouth looked almost human. She begged me to never go back there again. She told me whatever was up there wasn't a friend, and that I should never have let it into my life in the first place. I believed her at the time, but now, 5 years out of that forest and 1 year out of our rocky relationship, I miss the forest more than anything else. I miss my dreams, and I miss the feeling of ease and bliss I got from being there. I want almost more than anything to go back there and spend a night there, just to feel like that again. Safe, comfortable, and carefree. Should I go back? Maybe just for one night, or was she right? Is there something here that's dangerous? And if so, why has it never seemed dangerous to me? Why do I feel safest when I'm there? 11 years ago, I and my brother experienced something that I still cannot explain to this day. I have had many unusual and downright unexplainable experiences in my life, but this one has left a scar in my memory. As someone who is a skeptic of ghosts, demons, and active extraterrestrial contact on Earth, these things disturb me, as I can never provide a solid answer for my experiences. Especially this one. This story takes place in my youth, when I was 11 years old. My family was having a get-together at my grandparents' estate in the Nevada desert. Barbecue in the backyard, Grandma making her finest salad inside, and my parents drinking wine in the living room with my aunt and uncle. It was a really great evening, but the only thing I truly remember from that day was the encounter. My brother and I were outside in the front yard playing random little kid games. Just us and our imagination going wild. I remember we were getting a little bored and exhausted and took a seat on the curb to just talk about random stuff. It was getting dark, and I remember it being so peaceful out there, no cars going up the street, the light breeze hitting the palm tree, the ambient warmth that you find after the sun sets in the Nevada desert. It was just a really comfortable setting. I can't remember how long we sat out there or when this thing appeared. But I just remember my brother interrupting me and pointing up at the sky to our left. Up above the neighborhood, across the street from us, maybe 30 to 50 feet in the air, was something large. Well, two things. There were two massive white lights slowly moving from the left of our view to the right. It looked like it was only as far as our neighbor's house, which was right across the street from us. The strangest thing is that these lights emitted no sound, they just hovered slowly, and eventually they slowed down. We see the lights move away from each other, which makes it seem as if whatever this is turning to look upon us. That's really the best way I can explain it. I remember it suddenly getting blindingly bright at that point, so much so that I am bewildered as to how no neighbors, or even my family who was inside, did not notice this. It kind of reminds me of those drones in Half-Life that just blind you when they get close, except these were far larger, and we could still see our surroundings. It just sat there for a moment. I can't remember how long, but I do remember feeling disturbed and unsure of how to even react. As with my brother, we didn't even look at each other, we were just staring back at whatever it was in silence. And seemingly, as fast as it came into our view, it turned away and slowly moved outside of our view. As it disappeared behind houses, I slowly came back to my senses and gave a nervous laugh to my brother, who seemed anxious and asked if we could go inside now. It did not fully register with me what we just experienced, but we did go inside to try to tell our parents, who did not believe us. My grandmother did walk out into the driveway to see if she could still see it herself. She, of course, didn't. She said we probably saw a low helicopter since there is a hospital down the road that has one. Helicopters make sound, and if one were only 50 feet away from the house, I know our family would have run outside to see what was going on. On top of that, nothing was carrying these lights. There was no craft, no balloons, no drones, just two massive lights. Two massive, silent lights that somehow could move themselves and even direct their gaze upon two people. I remember asking about this years ago, but I was a lot younger and did not really know how to describe things so that others could understand what I was talking about. I do remember people bringing up the idea of skinwalkers. I did some research and, maybe? The location absolutely checks out, but giant, silent balls of light? That just doesn't fit the description for me. As much as I want to say aliens, I simply don't know. I'm a skeptic, and even after this, I just can't swallow the idea that we were in the presence of an extraterrestrial craft originating millions of light years away from our solar system. Secret military aircraft? Maybe, we were a couple hours away from the infamous Area 51. Who knows? All I can say is that what we saw is just unexplainable. Even with today's technology and drones, this is difficult to replicate. You would need 360-degree lights the size of a Toyota, two drones capable of lifting them, remaining absolutely quiet from an eighth of a block away, and staying in perfect synchronization to appear as one singular craft. And for what? Why? Why our random neighborhood? Why go through that effort to begin with? I do remember seeing a video that was taken not too far from where my grandparents' place was and looked almost identical to what we experienced. I was like 14 when I found it, and for the best of me, believe me, I tried, I cannot find that video anymore. I always used it to describe what we saw, and it frustrates me that I did not save that link somewhere. There are some things out there I don't know if I even want to know the answers to. This is one of them. Whatever that was, neither of us ever saw it again or prior. 5 teenagers, all around 15 years old, in an isolated area frequented by various homeless and drug-dependent individuals, at 11 p.m. sounds like a fun night, right? So to start, I'll say that this night and what I experienced definitely affected how I look at and think about certain situations. About 5 years ago, myself and 4 friends decided that we'd be asking our parents if we could stay out past our usual time, those who had to ask, being that it was the beginning of summer and the school year was over. So we all met up and are just walking around aimlessly talking and thinking of what we were going to do tonight as the sky fades from blue to a beautiful orangish pink color. As the sky turned dark with not a single star shining, thanks to light pollution, we arrived at a school that happened to have a mural painted on one of its huge walls. In front of the wall is a large metal scaffolding type structure. Being dumb and reckless, I decide to climb it because, why not? After getting to the second to top platform, so 3 platforms up, I asked my friend on the ground to snap a picture for me. After all was said and done in Area 1, we decided to leave and make our way down into the subway, where we hopped and then got onto a train and decided to ride to our next destination. The train ride was, honestly, the best thing about this night. Looking back, we were goofing around in this empty train, laughing, swinging on things, crossing through the different train cars, just being absolute hooligans. The train arrives at the stop, and a few friends are suggesting that we hop over this fence and explore the subway tunnels. With this suggestion, I get a feeling that I'd be very familiar with after the events of tonight. That feeling is dread. I shoot down this idea immediately, saying that it's a bad idea, and we leave the subway. Back on the streets, it seems even darker out due to there being more space between street lights around this area. Can we enter this big park? Honestly, I don't know what to call it. It's a really large area with a man-made lake as the focal point, with woods and other smaller bodies of water scattered about in the outskirts and a road that circles around the main area. We walked around in the wooded area until we realized the flashlights had seriously been killing our phone batteries. So around this time, I'm feeling a weird feeling, like we should be out here like yesterday. I keep a calm attitude, brushing it off as anxiety, a mistake, but I do say that we should probably start walking to an exit, which we do. The route we take is to the side/back exit. Now, at the back end of the park, it switches up a bit. The back end of the park is different in a few ways from the rest. Unlike its wavy, turn-filled counterpart, the back road was almost completely straight, which made it look much longer. Also, switch out trees and greenery with a highway that runs parallel right next to the back road, throw in filth, and there you go. You now have an image I had stuck in my head for a good while. So here we are walking down the back road, as my friend Gabe and I have the dumbest idea. Let's scare everyone, thinking that on the spot we go under the highway and easily find some broken wood for whatever reason while not being noticed by our friends. We toss the wood, causing a loud, echoing bang. We come running out, exclaiming that we're being chased, and to our surprise, it worked really well. They start running down the road, look back, and scream, bursting into a sprint. So we're pretty amused at first, until the screaming part. That's when we turned around to see some homeless man who looked to be high on something jogging towards us. I remember he was wearing a dirty, worn-out purple shirt. We thought it would be a good idea to not run away because we were standing on our ground, but I don't know if that was the best choice. The man jogs up and behind us, then walks between the two of us, puts his arm around my shoulder, and pulls my body around jokingly, saying something like, "Hey buddy, what you doing back here?" I don't think I responded, and if I did, I probably told him to get off me. So his playful shaking of me with his arm on my shoulder turned into him getting me into a chokehold from behind. I'm not sure how, but I threw this grown man off of me and onto the ground, then proceeded to run away. Western PA during the summer, in the early to mid-2000s, some friends and I would ride our bikes out on a local hiking or biking trail. We lived in a really rural area, but we were older kids by then. Anyway, me and my buddies were out on this trail, and it was just around dusk but not quite nightfall. As we were riding towards the head of the trail towards the main road that would take us home, we saw someone walking towards us. My one friend, who was a bit ahead, stopped in his tracks. When we caught up, he didn't look back at us. He just kept staring at the figure of a person ahead, almost transfixed. We all looked alike. I remember being frozen in fear, and I shivered, but I couldn't understand why. We couldn't quite make out what the figure looked like yet, just that it was moving towards us from a distance. We all sort of snapped out of it, but we were all visibly disturbed. I think in the moment I chalked it up to stranger danger, in the middle of nowhere, right before dark, but it was definitely more than just that. We talked for what felt like a few minutes, but it was almost certainly 30 seconds at most. It was clear we were all spooked. We decided to just stay on the other side of the trail and bike past as fast as we could. We start to build up speed, and as we approach, it's clear the figure is moving slowly, like really slowly. As we passed him, I only glanced at the figure. It was clearly a man wearing a helmet, but his head was down, and it was almost as if he was hunched over, but not quite. It just looked like the walk of someone who was sort of depressed, if that makes sense. He was also holding something in his hand, but I didn't look long enough to see what it was. I broke off my gaze pretty quickly and rode right past. At no point did he look up at me or the boy or girl ahead of me. No acknowledgement, no reaction to the speed that we rode by him, nothing, as if we weren't even there. Then, not even 100 feet after we passed this guy, my buddy, who was the last of us and right behind me, wipes out. We all stop, look at my buddy, and then look at the figure. The figure has now turned around and is looking at us. He's wearing an old outfit, like 1800s or very early 1900s old, an old helmet with a headlamp that was unlit. His clothes looked ragged and torn from the waist up. I didn't look waist down because I ended up making eye contact. He was pale, not like a stereotypical ghost, just like someone who hadn't seen much sunlight in quite some time. His skin looked atrocious, but he also didn't look that old, just like he hadn't bathed or taken care of his hygiene. It was someone I can say I never saw before, and living in such a rural area, that wasn't all that normal, at least not at that time of day. The look on his face was that of shock. As if we had surprised him or that we were as off-putting to him as he was to us. He said nothing, made no noise, and just stared in a state of shock, the same as we were, presumably. I glanced away to look at my friend and then shot my gaze back. But he was gone. There was no noise to indicate he ran into the woods, which would have been the only means to get out of sight. Even if he had, there's no physical way he could have gotten into them without us seeing, because you could clearly see through the initial brush, and there would have been a ton of noise. But there wasn't, nothing but crickets and the typical background noise you'd hear, almost dead silent otherwise. My buddy, who fell, picked up his bike and bolted, and we followed. We rode back onto the main road, then back to my house because it was the closest. Once we reached my garage, we shut the door and caught our breaths. I had made note that, on the way home, I hadn't seen any vehicles parked on the main road. We began trying to rationalize what we had seen. There was a coal mine somewhat close to the trail at one time, but it had been closed at least 50 years before, maybe more. One of my friends thought maybe someone was inspecting it, trying to avoid another Centralia incident. But I said I hadn't seen any vehicles on the road. My other friend said he never broke eye contact except to blink. 1 second later, the figure was there, then he blinked, and he was gone. We ended up going inside, and my mom seemed very concerned, especially since my friend who fell was bleeding all over the place from his various cuts and scrapes. We ended up telling her and my dad what happened. My mom seemed to agree that it must have been someone inspecting the old mine, but my dad pointed out there are better roads with faster access to that area, and they likely use an ATV to reach it from there. Even then, the mine's entrances were flooded by the time he was a teenager. It'd be pretty tough to go down there without scuba gear. That only seemed to upset us more, and after bandaging up my friend, my mom told them they could stay the night. We didn't sleep, we talked about what happened, played Smash Brothers, drank pop, and watched various VHS tapes. We were never allowed to go on that trail by ourselves around night again, and honestly, I never wanted to after that. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or not, but I don't know that I can explain what happened either. We're all much older now, obviously. We're all still like family because our parents were close and we lived in a close-knit community, but we all live in different places now. Every few holidays we all end up coming home and talking about them. My one buddy has a theory that I don't necessarily believe, but I think is interesting. Basically, he thinks we were in some sort of time distortion where some coal miner was heading to his shift. When he was walking by, he didn't initially look because he felt that same feeling of dread and feared what was coming at him. When he finally did look, we looked like kids completely different from any kids he'd ever seen, riding bikes that looked nothing like he'd ever seen, and wearing weird clothes. Additionally, he made no noise. Maybe he also couldn't hear us and only looked back once we passed to see what was happening. Again, I personally think it's a little far-fetched, but to be honest, I don't really know how to explain it. Outside of a ghost, I have no better theories. So I live in Poland, and this story happened to me in 2005. At that time, I was 18 years old. Since my dad died and my siblings left family house a few years later, we lived only with my mom, but at that time, Halloween night, but in Poland we are not celebrating it, we celebrate All the Saints, that is the next day. She went to my older sister who lives in Warsaw to see Powązki Cemetery. So as a smart and responsible teenager, I asked my at-time best friend and neighbor, let's call him Andrew, to come over for some beer, etc. He was up for it but had some stuff to do, so he was about to come later, so I went back home, ate some dinner. It was like 7 to 8 p.m., so not that late, and went to get some showers. When I almost finished, I heard the front door closing, so I yelled at him to sit and wait for me to dry myself. And then it hit me. I locked the front door before I got to the shower, and he didn't respond when I yelled. At this point, I should mention that maybe not my house only, but a pretty big area around it, and I mean, nearby villages, are full of spooky stories. Not some extra believer or paranoid, so I'm not scared out easily, but at this time, I was pretty sure I would encounter someone when I left the bathroom, but guess what? No one was there. My friend arrived like 15 to 20 minutes later, so I let him in, but I didn't mention that to him. So we sat in the kitchen with beer, laughed, etc., but I see there's something wrong with Andrew. When I asked what's wrong, he just said, "Can we go to your room? I feel like someone stares at me." Anyway, that got me pretty creeped out for some stuff that happened before in my house, but I will explain that at the end. So I double-checked whether the front doors were locked, and we went to my room. We watched some funny movies that talked about girls and all that stuff. And something like 11 p.m. maybe, again, the same sound like someone was closing the front doors. We looked at each other because we'd heard the same thing, so we went to check it out. And yeah, the front doors are still locked. The rest of the night was pretty nervous, but nothing else happened. The worst part was that when we got outside, like 4 a.m., Andrew was going to his home, and I was forced to go back alone, but I've stayed awake until sunrise, just for sure. Personally, I had two theories about what was happening. The first was that the house itself had some kind of presence. From what I know, it was bought but placed in my dad's hometown. The house is made of wooden logs, and it was taken apart and put back here in one piece, but I don't know anything about the previous owners. I need to ask my mom about more details. The reason I said I was scared was when Andrew said that he feels like someone is watching his stories of the first year when we moved into the house. Apparently, in that first year, my parents' room was barely usable because you'd get a weird feeling when you entered it. Just like when you enter a room full of people who don't like you, they stare at you with that GTFO dude look. And Andrew sat in the chair opposite the mom's room entrance door. My second theory is that all of the nearby area is more or less haunted since many people died here during World War II. This is a personal story that happened to me a few years ago, when I was 26. I've been too scared to talk about it until now out of fear of being made fun of, so here is my story. 4 years ago, my great-grandmother passed away at the age of 98. We were close all the way into my adult years, so the death hit me hard. She lived in a one-story house in a rural town 30 minutes outside of Springfield, Missouri. Her house sat on a large and heavily forested piece of land. There was a large hill several hundred feet behind the house that dropped off into a creek. I spent almost my entire childhood staying on this piece of land and had learned how to take care of it and the house. After the funeral services, I volunteered to stay and take care of the land while my family decided what to do with it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to buy the land, so I wanted to spend as much time out there as I could. My first 3 days were spent packing up items and cleaning the house. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, so I didn't have to worry about unwanted guests that would get in the way of my packing and disturb my personal way of mourning the loss of someone so close to me. The fourth day is when the odd events started occurring. I slept in a sleeping bag in the living room, and when I woke up, I immediately screamed. A few inches away from my face was a dead copperhead snake. It was normal for snakes and other small animals to get in the house, so seeing the snake wasn't surprising. It was the fact that it was so close to my face and could have bitten me at any moment while I was sleeping. I briefly wondered why the snake had just come in the house and died because there were no physical signs that anything was wrong with it, so I threw it outside and continued with my day, and the weird event was almost forgotten. Later that evening, I decided to go for a walk through the woods to enjoy the nice weather and reminisce about the good times I'd had in the woods and all the games I used to play. I was walking along an old path that led to a well. The path was narrow and was close to the drop-off that led to the creek. I heard a branch snap behind me and instinctively turned my head. I didn't see anything, so I assumed it was an animal and continued walking. Just a few minutes later, I heard a snap to my left and turned to look again, but I still didn't see anything. I started to worry that I was being stalked by something, but it was rare to see large animals in this area, so I continued walking. I heard a third snap directly in front of me, but now instead of being worried, I was upset. I was convinced that someone else was out here trying to scare me, so I shouted at what I assumed to be a person. "Go away." And everything went uncomfortably silent. But I started to hear footsteps approaching in front of me, but I couldn't see anything. They got faster and faster until whoever or whatever it was running right at me. I covered my face with my arms and waited to be attacked by some invisible person, but the footsteps stopped. I slowly lowered my arms, but instead of seeing a person, a bobcat, or even a bear, I saw a gigantic spider in the middle of a web I hadn't noticed before. If I'd taken one more step, I would have ended up being bitten. I turned and ran as fast as I could through the overgrowth and back to the house. I was spooked, but I was out in the middle of the woods, and sometimes things like this happen. I knew this land and the house well, so I pushed through the night, and for the next 2 days, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I started yard work my second week staying out at the house, and it wasn't bad. I'd actually found some old trinkets from my childhood that I'd buried under a tree. While I was picking up fallen branches from a storm the previous night, I noticed a clump of hair was caught in one of them. I remember its color being brown and black and considered the possibility of it being a rare encounter with a bear, but there were no tracks that I could see. I brushed it off again, but I was starting to think that maybe someone else was staying on the property, and that upset me. I decided to stay up late to see if I could catch the person in the act. Nothing happened until around 2 a.m. I remember everything so vividly because of how terrified I was. It started with branches crunching and the sound of the wheelbarrow I'd been using earlier falling over. I readied my flashlight and a small knife just in case whoever it was got violent. I heard them step onto the front porch and pull at the screen door, but they quickly abandoned it and instead started walking around the house. I could hear them scraping something sharp against the house, and I was furious. I stood up and shined my flashlight at the nearest window that I assumed the person was standing near and shouted at them. "I have a weapon. Get off of this property now." Everything stopped, and I was positive that whoever it was had left, until I heard something slam against the window so hard that I was surprised it didn't break. My flashlight shined on the person, and at first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It had long, dark hair and eyes that were way too big for its face. Its skin was wrinkled and reminded me of a naked mole rat. It pressed its face against the glass and fogged it up with its breath. I heard it run around the house several times and bang on every wall, window, and door every time it passed them. This went on for hours, and I was too scared to move or do anything. I was completely alone, being tormented by some strange monster. Every now and then, I would get the courage to shine my flashlight and catch a glimpse of the thing. Each time I saw it, it looked more animal-like. All I could do was cry and wait for it to go away. Finally, just after sunrise, the running and banging stopped, but I didn't dare move until well after 9 a.m. It took all of my courage to open the front door and see what damage had been done to the house and yard after the terrifying experience from the night before, but there was nothing. No footprints, no scratches against the house, or broken or cracked windows. It was almost like I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I saw and had experienced was real. Nothing else happened for the rest of my stay there, and by the end of the month, my grandfather came to pick me up and take care of the belongings I'd packed away. I was still terrified by what had happened, but I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined it until my grandfather spoke to me. He told me that he was happy that this land was being sold and how much he hated growing up here. When I asked him why, his answer seemed to validate my experience. Now, my grandfather is a serious, no-nonsense man. He was the type of person who stayed quiet, but when he did speak, you'd better listen because it was important. He was a hardened war veteran and devoted Christian, so things like paranormal and supernatural were just fairy tales to him. He made sure to tell his children, me, and the rest of my siblings and cousins that. He told me how his mother, my great-grandmother, would always try to scare him and his sister with stories about the land being guarded by monsters. The story says that these monsters, hybrids are what he called them, were the children of falsely accused witches. The people living in the area back when this was going on claimed that the children were part witch and part animal and needed to be killed, so they were left in the forest to die. He said that when the witch children died, they came back as spirits and claimed the woods as their own, and any unwelcome visitors would be tortured until they were literally scared to death. Just as their falsely accused mothers had been scared when they had been killed. My grandfather said he didn't believe in much outside of his religion, but he believed that the hybrids were real and that he had been tormented by one when he tried to go hunting in the woods for the first time and shot his first deer. He believed he had upset the hybrids by killing an innocent animal and never stepped foot on the land with a weapon, and they finally left him alone. Maybe this is a foolish thing to believe, but I believe that the story my grandfather told me is true simply because we both had similar terrifying experiences. If I'd had a camera, I would have tried to take a picture of the creature. I remember every detail about what I saw and will be burned into my memory forever. All of my childhood memories seem tainted now because of this experience, and now I don't think I'm going to miss the land as much as I first thought. It didn't take long for the land and the house to be sold. The hybrids, or whatever it is out there, can be somebody else's nightmare. One night was more than enough for me. So my family had a beach house that was originally owned by my grandparents. It was my grandfather's favorite place, and I was super close to him. We started renovating it after he passed away, and my grandmother had dementia. Nobody had been down there in a year since he had died. My girlfriend and I showed up, and weird stuff started happening. It started out with her makeup disappearing, along with all of her makeup bags. We both saw it on the counter in the bathroom. We turned around, and it completely disappeared. Later that evening, we were watching a movie on an iPad after we had poured a drink from the bar and had it sitting on the table. We were watching the iPad, and then all of a sudden it was out of the corner of both of our eyes. We saw it move 3 feet across the table and then a foot back. I turned to her and said, "Holy shit, did you see that?" And she nodded. 30 minutes later, it happened again. It looked like she pushed the cup across the table and then pulled it back. I checked the table. There was no humidity or condensation. The last day, she ended up walking in and finding all of her makeup all over the counter, just like she had left it. We left and came back down a couple weeks later, and she walked in and saw the painting of him hanging in the main room and called him Mr. instead of a doctor, and that was a big pet peeve of his when he was alive since he was a very formal person. So she yells out, "Mr. X, we are back," trying to be funny, but instead the reaction she got was the louver door into the kitchen slamming open and then slowly going back and clicking shut as if the doorknob had been twisted. I ended up going back down there another time and letting out a cigarette since I was drinking, and all of the light bulbs exploded on the porch. After that, we decided to renovate the place to sell it, and we had a contractor come in to redo things. One of the subcontractors was a painter who apparently decided to spend the night there instead of driving back home since we didn't have cameras and we weren't down, and it was a drive there for him. The problem hours he had his dog scratching up, and he was smoking in the house well at about 9:30 at night. All of the lights in the place went out, and he looked out on the back, facing the water through all of the floor porch and ceiling windows, and just saw black shadows running back and forth and banging on the windows. He left all his stuff with his dog in the truck and would not come back, so he picked up his stuff and gave it to him that week. I went down to check on the progress. I was given a grand total of 10 hours to sleep and talk to the contractor. Came in, and the chandelier that was hanging in the main room was assembled in a box, and we put it into the closet. I turned around and drove back. My father got a phone call later that day from the contractor asking if I was there and if I had rewired the chandelier and rehung it. This started a conversation with my father, who did not believe that the house was haunted and didn't believe me, but then the contractor told him that the house has definitely been haunted since his table saw, and all of his tools disappeared when he walked out of the bedroom that he had them in when he was cutting the flooring. And then it randomly reappeared in the same exact place. But what really got weird was that a hurricane came in and decimated the area right as my grandmother passed away, and the only thing that was wrong with the house was the door of her shed flying off. Both houses on either side were destroyed down to the foundation. Before this, I was a devout atheist who believed there was nothing supernatural, but now I have to believe there is something out there. I was really cagey about it with the rest of my family until I was at a family reunion talking to my aunt on my dad's side, and I mentioned that the house was haunted, and then she brought up that she was at a dinner party in England at an old estate, and everybody was sitting at the table, and an orb of light floated through a wall down the table slowly and then disappeared into the other wall. Everyone at the table ignored it until somebody said, "Did you just ducking see that?" And then all 20 people at the table said they did. Also, the house she lives in is 300 years old and apparently haunted to the point that my cousin wouldn't sleep in his room since a guy would wake him up, shake his foot in the bed, and then yell at him. I was generally restricted from going into the cemetery by myself when I was younger. Up until I was about 11 or 12, I was glued to my parents' sides when we walked the property. My Uncle Cal used to be the top candidate as my chaperone when neither of my mothers were available. He's a pretty solid dude, and he's willing to knock out anyone who poses a threat to me or anyone else in my family. One morning, when I was 6 years old, my mother needed to be at the school to discuss an upcoming festival. Cal wasn't what you would consider a natural when it came to kids. He was so nice, and he did his very best when he was left to care for me, but he never really mastered the art of talking or playing with me. For example, on this particular day, he decided to play hide and seek with me. This wasn't anything new to me. I played all the time with my mom and aunts. But they always knew to go over the rules very carefully before we'd play. Rule 1, stay in the yard and don't go in the cemetery. Rule 2, do not hide in any holes or dens made by animals. Rule 3, always come out of your hiding spot when the seeker yells ally, ally, oxen free. Uncle Cal didn't know about these rules, and I wasn't about to remind him. I wanted to find a new spot to hide. If I had to crouch down inside the chicken coop one more time, I was going to scream. Cal hated to hide, so he volunteered to be at every time for this game. This was an added bonus. When I played my parents and their sisters, I had to be at all the damn time. I was slow, and they were competitive, so they didn't hold back when they got the chance to tag me. You have to count to 100. I informed my uncle as I led him to the shed that would be home base. And you can't peek. He nodded along and turned to face the wall of the shed. I was running before he even started counting. I wasn't going to hide behind a gravestone or mausoleum. Even at a young age, I knew how disrespectful that would have been. But there was a patch of trees in the center of the yard that were calling to me. I discovered a few weeks ago that one of the trees, an aspen, had low, hanging branches that I could climb if I got a running start. Kids climbed one similar to it in the play area at school. I had joined in with them once, but my Aunt Gloria, who taught at the school with my mom, Katie, was on playground duty that day, and she immediately made me get down. Without an adult to tell me no and with at least another 60 seconds left, I sprinted through the cemetery towards my goal. The tree, which I have since named Eulalie, after the Edgar Allan Poe poem, welcomed me with yellowing leaves and white branches hanging down like arms outstretched for a hug. I didn't hesitate. In fact, I picked up speed and lunged as soon as I was within reach. With what I can only call pure luck, I was able to grab onto the lowest branch and pull myself up on the first try. I was only 5 or so feet off the ground, but I felt as though I had just climbed Denali Peak. Knowing that I could still be seen in my bright blue jacket, I scrambled up a couple more branches and positioned them so that I was behind a large cluster of leaves that had yet to fall. By the time I was fully situated, Cal was done counting and had been moving about the yard for a few minutes. He checked in the usual places that a 6-year-old may have hidden. Most of them were places that I had frequented in hide and seek for days. And a few places he looked in were ones I had never thought of but catalogued in my brain for the next time I played with my parents. I could see him quite easily from my little perch, and I was able to laugh at him without fear of being heard because he was nowhere near me. He was scratching his head and double-checking everywhere he'd previously looked before going into the house to search. At this point, I was getting sore, so I leaned back against the trunk of the tree and waited for him to come back out. The air was quiet, and I could hear the chirps of some birds nesting in the surrounding trees. If I hadn't been sitting on a narrow branch, 20 feet above the ground, I would have allowed myself to drift off. But I stayed alert, hoping to see my uncle reappear soon. It was then that I felt a tingly feeling at the back of my neck. It wasn't unlike the sensation I got when my mom's fingers ran through my hair or rubbed my back. Feeling relaxed, I glanced around and noticed just how still it was in this little oasis centered in our cemetery. At this point, I was feeling rather euphoric. It wasn't until I was older that I found something that simulated a similar feeling. I won't say what it was, but I will say that it was baked into a brownie. Suddenly, I really wanted to find my mom. I had this overwhelming need to tell them that I loved them and give them hugs. I felt guilty for going into the cemetery and breaking their rules. I quickly began to climb out of the tree, and in the process, I ended up missing a branch somehow and falling to the ground from about 8 feet up. Later on, I would learn that I broke my wrist and thumb when I landed, but somehow, I didn't feel the pain. I just had to get to my parents. In my delusional state, I decided that the best route to take to get to town was through the woods behind the cemetery. Probably because I was closer to the woods than I was to the road at that point. But the forest was thick and full of traps that had been set by hunters and forgotten about. It was another place I was told to avoid. Luckily, I didn't run into any traps that day. There was a pretty clear path that had been made by my mother Aga and her siblings back when they were young, so I stuck to that. That was when things got hazy. At some point, the euphoric sensation turned into one of dread. I began to feel as though someone or something was chasing me. I remember crying and calling out for Cal to come find me. Eventually, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying in a pile of leaves and staring up at the night sky. Pain was flaring up my right arm, and my feet stung. Climbing to my feet, I looked around and realized I was still in the woods. It took me a moment to get my bearings, but soon I figured out where I was. I had only been a few yards from the path, and headed in the direction of the cemetery. My jacket was gone, as were my shoes and socks. I don't know what the hell happened there. My tiny feet were freezing and stung against the rocky ground. When I emerged from the forest into the cemetery, I could see red lights flashing up by the house, and I immediately knew who they were for. For a moment, I contemplated turning back and living my life in the woods. But I soldiered on, and by the time I was halfway across the graveyard, I could hear someone shouting out my name. It was my mother, Katie. She was the strict one, with an Irish temper and a hand made for spanking. When I saw her coming running through the cemetery gate, though, I immediately felt a rush of relief. I couldn't run, I was too sore, and I could only hold up my left arm, but I called out to her as hot tears streamed down my cheeks. She picked me up and hugged me close. She didn't yell at me for wandering off, nor did she scold me for not wearing a coat or shoes. She just asked me if I was all right and told me that she loved me. Even then, when adrenaline was coursing through my veins, I was relieved that she was taking pity on me. I was way too drained to get a spanking. Katie took me to the house where a hysterical Aga was waiting with her sisters and my Aunt Gloria. I didn't get to stay home, though. Once they realized I had been injured and out in the woods for nearly 12 hours, I was placed in the waiting ambulance and rushed to the next town over for medical care. I was released the next day with a bright pink cast and an order to stay inside for at least 72 hours. The shaman visited us the next day. He was summoned by my grandfather after I'd told him about what led me into the woods. My parents stayed with me as I described the ordeal to the shaman. I told him about how happy I felt and about how I had longed to be with my parents so much that I went into the woods, which I feared more than any grave or mausoleum. After all was said and done, the shaman went out to the patch of trees I had been hiding in and began to bless them and burn sage and incense. He told my mother that I could have been influenced by a spirit. He said that it was likely a young child who had passed away and missed their parents. Katie, who wasn't as superstitious as her wife, was skeptical of this explanation. She believed in spirits and all, but she didn't think that they had the power to control living beings. But she didn't have a reasonable explanation as to why her 6-year-old wandered into the woods and blacked out. So, they allowed the shaman to go through with his rituals and reinforced their rule that I wasn't to go into the cemetery alone. Uncle Cal, who had been royally terrified after the ordeal, was the only one to yell at me. I was surprised. He was always a pretty chill guy, and he never really got on me before. But he had been terrified that he'd lost me forever, and when he found out that it was all because I had broken a rule that I was very familiar with, he blew his top. This was one of many unexplained events that occurred in my childhood. I wish I knew more about what caused it, but even my tribe's leaders don't have an explanation. They just used it as an excuse to warn children not to wander about on hallowed land.